Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor. And before we get to the episode, please, if you like what we're doing here at Plotlines, like, share, and subscribe, and join our Discord server if you want to join our community. Today, I have with me Ryan Grant to discuss St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
These two are just very interesting saints to begin with, and today is More's death day and feast day, even though his feast, as we just discussed, is chaotic in history. So what is your sort of how would I say this? Well, do you have a favorite of the two?
I guess my favorite is actually Fisher because he's a bit of the underdog because he's sort of a forgotten saint in the whole mess. You even see where in the Reform calendar after in the New Mass, they're both on the same day, but yet everyone says Happy Feast of Thomas More, and they forget that Fisher even exists. And yet Fisher was a much better theologian than More. Fisher was the one who actually did the active work in defending Catherine's marriage to Henry, whereas More kind of sat in the background trying not to get into the middle of it very desperately. So it's an odd thing where More is then put out there as a defender of marriage, and Fisher's the one doing all the work. and More was only killed because he had incurred Anne Boleyn's disfavor by not showing up to her coronation. And so he's the only layman out of all the bishops of the realm who's ordered to swear to the act of succession. So, which he wouldn't do on account of the preamble, which formally affirms Anne to be married to Henry, and that marriage to be valid, and Henry's marriage to Catherine to be invalid. And so both Fisher and More saw that as a denial of papal infallibility, like an implicit one. And so that was the first thing. It's like the act of succession was no problem because Parliament can make. We'll talk about that later. But anyway. So Fisher does all this work. He's celebrated as the greatest theologian in Christendom. His work on justification is instrumental at the Council of Trent in terms of formulating their definition, and yet nobody talks about him. So that's kind of why I'm more on the Fisher's kind of more my favorite.
Yeah, makes sense. Also, it seems to me that Fisher died more for the marriage, and Thomas More died more for papal supremacy in direct case. He
had incurred Henry's wrath for that reason, whereas More had not, because More had played it safe. But at the same time, both of them, it was papal supremacy when it came down to it, because it was that act of succession, and then later the act of royal supremacy, which followed it, both of which were denials of the papacy. So those are the articles that specifically they both deny. So it really is, they're both, executed for the same thing.
Okay. I find it most curious that Anglicans consider both of them saints.
It's an odd thing that came in with the Oxford movement, unless I'm mistaken. I'd have to get someone of Anglican extraction to correct me on that, but I do believe that their days entered the Book of Common Prayer during sometime in the Oxford movement into the Church of England itself, and it was sort of like reconciling with ghosts of the past, and basically say, yeah, we acknowledge that Henry was a rotten guy and these two men were holy men, but hey, the Church of England is the continuation of this ancient medieval monarchy, which, if you believe that, I've got got a bridge to sell you, and not in London. But anyway, it's versus, at least with the Anglo-Catholics, they have a very specific point about their church, but they're not under any illusions about its origin. As opposed to that older idea that, the Anglican Church goes back to Augustine of Canterbury, and More would virulently disagree with that, as well as Fisher. So, but anyway, it's just part of that. And that really comes from the 19th century, where the French are building in neoclassical art, and they're building in classical Roman designs in their architecture. So Victoria decides, well, we are decidedly not French, so we are going to build in Gothic. And part of that Gothic revival moves hand in hand. It was a movement on its own, but the two really worked hand in hand. The move to Gothic meant a looking back to England's medieval roots, and those medieval roots were, of course, Catholic, even though the Queen is quite a low church Protestant, Queen Victoria. So the Oxford movement and many of the figures in there, both those like Newman who became Catholic and those who did not, like Pusey, they're all looking toward that medieval church as Anglicans. And that's and I think, and that's part of what spurred on, and even the Church of England itself, it spurs on kind of this look again at the Reformation. And that's why you see a good number of converts in that period. Even Father Faber, you read a diary of Father Faber's where he was traveling in Italy, and he has conversation. He relates conversations. I'm not sure they would have been ipsissima verba, but as he remembered them, and just debating with people, debating things about the Tudors or Catholic, and he just stops thinking. He adds that instead of like some rejoinding pro-Protestant response as a Protestant minister, Faber simply adds, that he was thoughtful about these things. He's thinking it over, as it were. And then at last he wrote a little booklet defending Henry VIII's break in Rome. But you can even see by the end of it, he himself can't reason it. He's just trying to finish the book because he's already pretty much on his way to Rome. And he does. And then he joins Newman in the oratory. But
yeah. So Fisher is the older of the two. He was both a churchman and, would you consider him a statesman as well?
He would not want to be considered a statesman. Every bishop was a part of the House of Lords in England. So in a technical sense, he's a temporal lord as well as, but his business was always the church. And he only, he did have some, role advising Archbishop Warham in the very beginning of Henry's reign. That was towards the end of Henry VII's reign, but not very much. And he definitely detested that. He preferred to be in his diocese. So Fisher is born in 1469, on October 9th, 1469, in a little town near York called Beverley. And it was a merchant town, a lot of woolers, a lot of mercers, a lot of various tradesmen in the town. And it was smack dab in the middle of the Wars of the Roses. The White Rose of Lancaster faced against the Red Rose of York. And that is a contest that actually itself goes back even before Henry V to his father, Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke. He seizes the crown, and then some of his backers say, we have a better claim to the throne than Henry Bolingbroke. So we should be king, actually, not him. So they revolt. The various houses that with the better claims revolt against Henry. He fights back. Eventually he dies, and his son Henry V reconciles everybody and says, now let's forget about this. Let's go fight in France. And then they when they're standing victories and conquer the country, and Henry V passes into legend very quickly, actually, because he dies of dysentery not long after, and leaving behind a 1-year-old son just before he could formally obtain the title and be crowned as King of France, because that was part of the treaty. Just before that, he dies of dysentery. And then his 1-year-old son, under his minority, Henry VI, he grows up and he's raised very pious, which actually is very good, except it's not very good for the aristocracy, as that means he doesn't want to make war, and he's not committed to the war in France. And that's when, of course, Joan of Arc appears, and so many things that by 1453, the English now are reduced back to Calais. Henry VI now is going through fits of insanity, probably brought on by porphyria or other royal diseases. And now he is in and out, questionable ruler, and he's lost what the nobility put their blood and sweat into. So once again, the dynastic complaint appears again, and there's nothing left but to fight for it. So Edward, the Duke of York, versus Henry VI, the king, but now really king of a faction at this point. So they just fight it out. Now, so meanwhile, in all this, John Fisher's born. And so the town he was born in, like I said, it was too important for either side to alienate. So there's no violation of the town like in certain other places in England. So it's largely safe from this whole fratricidal conflict in the background. Fisher then, we don't know a whole lot about his early life, except that he gives a few anecdotes that are at least indicative that he knew something about it, about things like hunting and maintaining dogs for this purpose, and several other things that, which we could only gather just by, limited glimpses he gives in sermons of material that he could not have known from being a bishop. And it's just a safe assumption that he had some working in these things as a child, mending nets and other things of this sort. So, but he was very bright, and he went to one of many free monastic schools at the time, which were teaching grammar. And what that meant was you would learn Latin. And so the medieval trivium, as it were, which is based on a Roman system of education and persisted throughout the Middle Ages, where you learned Latin grammar, and so you learned, basically to speak. Then you learned logic, which is how to speak correctly. And then you learned rhetoric, which is how to sound very good while doing the other two. And to put it simply, and he was very good at that and very bright. So his father dies, his mother remarries, and so his stepfather then sees to finishing his education, and he's sent to Cambridge. And so he takes his degrees at Cambridge, and quickly gets his bachelor's and his master's, and then is ordained to the priesthood. And he had to get a dispensation. It's actually one of the reasons why we know the year he was born, is because he had to receive a dispensation prior to because he was below the canonical age. Right. And so so that helps us trace his dates more correctly. So then, he's made a priest, and he starts beginning his duties. He was clearly a very holy priest. In those days, if you went to university and took your degrees and you were very good at Latin, you had one of two options. You went into church, or you went into state service. And it's a lot of people who went into church service were not necessarily following a vocation. A lot of times it was simply just as door to open to money and power if you were witty enough and crafty enough. We'll see that, for example, Cardinal Wolsey had, takes that route of it. Fisher, on the other hand, truly does have a devotion we can see through his life, through his sermons, through the things he does. He has a very clear, deep sense of the holiness and what his duty is as a priest. So, and we'll pause with him at Cambridge, because what happens in the meantime is the Wars of the Roses had come to a conclusion. And Edward IV, the Duke of York, was victorious, and now becomes Edward IV. And I could talk about War of the Roses again for probably a whole day podcast. We're not going to do that.
Maybe
so
one
he is
day.
now, king, and he's gifted with an heir and a spare. Right, he's got two sons. Perfect. So it seems like he's going to be very much in control of things, except he mysteriously dies, and nobody knows why. One of his brothers he had to have killed for revolting against him. Even at that time, contemporaneously, suspicion fell on his other brother, Richard. And so Richard then becomes the guardian of his two sons, the princes of the Tower, and is more or less the regent. The two princes are put in the Tower for safety, and they die under mysterious circumstances. Thomas More, in his treatise on Richard III, which is written in Latin, I'm sure there's a translation of it somewhere, I'm not sure, which was largely a vehicle for him to express political opinions. He decided to shelve it lest it get too toxic and get him in trouble. And so, but he alleges there that Richard III had the princes of the Tower smothered, strangled with a pillow. And so, that was the common view, actually, even during Richard's time. So one thing Richard didn't count on, so he becomes Richard III, and the widow of Edward IV, whose children have just been murdered, and she certainly believes they've been murdered. She shows hell knoweth no fury, like a woman scorned. She goes to the other side, to the last remnant of the Lancastrian house, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Now, Margaret Beaufort, during the period of the beginning stages of the War of the Roses, was married to a man named Owen Tudor. And she was, a noble scion of the Lancastrian sign, going back to John of Gaunt and all that. And, she was very young. He married her. And so she was, I think, 12 when she conceived with the young Henry, Tudor. And
Wow.
of course, and it was, 12 was this is very shocking for modern people. 12 was the youngest legally permissible age for carnal knowledge. To know your wife, but it was not customary. People normally didn't do that. Normally you waited till she was 14.
You had to be older as a
is
man,
shocking
right?
to modern people also. What's that?
You would be older than as a man versus if you were a woman.
Oh, certainly. As a man, you'd be anywhere from 16 to 30, maybe even 40. Which again didn't bother people in those days, even though we find it positively horrific, and for good reason. But So typically, though, you would not have carnal knowledge. Usually, a betrothal would happen at 12, and you wouldn't have carnal knowledge until 14. That was what was more customary, right? Because it was just seen 12 was still questionable whether puberty had happened. It was not. It was more for making alliance. The reason it was legally permissible is if you're married. Well, you're married, so it was meant basically for purposes of betrothal and other purposes, and that was the reason for that. Again, absolutely shocking to our modern habits, and for good reason. But in those times wasn't bothering, and of course it's all done with a venal and accommodating church, accommodating the crown, Henry VI at the time. So Margaret Beaufort has, young Henry Tudor. Her husband dies, she remarries, but she never conceives again. So as the fortunes, favor the Yorkists in the War of the Roses, Henry is sent into exile in Brittany. And his first language was probably French. He spent most of his life in France. And and now what happens, though, right around the time of Bosworth, is Elizabeth Woodville comes to Margaret Beaufort, and she promises that if Margaret Beaufort will bring her son back from exile, and he defeats Richard, she will give her daughter Elizabeth to Henry as a bride, and will unite the houses of York and Lancaster, and that will bring a permanent end to the war, and she'll be avenged. So that's precisely what happens. And Henry comes with the French army and very much the connivance of the French court to England with an army. And because Richard III was so loath, there's a lot of societies that want to say, hey, Richard III wasn't that bad. Henry the Tudor, I'm sure Henry Tudor was actually a scoundrel in his reign. But but Richard III was very much hated to the point where a lot of the nobility step aside and watch to support the victor, rather than taking part in the battlefield with Richard. So with the help of the French pikemen in Henry's pay, Richard is defeated at the Battle of Bosworth, and Henry Tudor becomes king, Henry VII, from that point on. And it's curious, too, because Margaret Beaufort it was a queen in her own right, technically. But she steps aside for her son, of course, but this fact made living with the younger Elizabeth Woodville very hard. Because she's the queen, but Margaret Beaufort technically has the claim to be queen too, and the two of them did not get along. But anyway, so Henry the Seventh then begins to reign. He's very cosmopolitan. He's been abroad. He's multilingual, but he decides to run England rather more like how France is run, and this causes a lot of problems. He wants to crush every last strain of the Yorkist side. Because, of course, there's another revolt. You got the incidents of Perkin Warbeck, for example, who's a Flemish clothing merchant, that some of the Yorkists say, hey, he looks a lot like one of the princes of the Tower. So they put him up as a fake prince, pretender, to rise up against Henry, whose claim was, in fact, very tenuous, I might add. Henry VII's claim. So he was open to these kind of challenges. And so Henry becomes very brutal. He uses taxation to crush so much of the nobility and get them into line. And he continues, of course, the state domination of church for the better part of his reign. So in the midst of this, so John Fisher is a priest now, and he's established at Cambridge, and he's the master of Michael House, which is his duties to teach younger boys and undergraduate and preach. And so during this course, there's always these fights between universities and the local towns or the local cities, where there's the same thing in Oxford and other great universities, where the cities are mad because of rowdy students or encroaching upon various lands or leases not being paid and what have you. And so the university and the towns are fighting each other. And so they decided to send a delegation down to see the king to advocate for the rights of Cambridge in the dispute. And one of those sent was John Fisher. And on this particular trip, he happens to meet Lady Margaret Beaufort, who is the Queen Mother. And so she is beyond impressed with Fisher because of his holiness and his learning and his sense and brilliance, intelligence. And so she makes him her confessor. And while she, under his direction, she starts hearing mass 4 times a day. She devotes herself to, whenever she's not busy hearing mass, she's making translations from French. She single-handedly funds the printing press coming to England, as it hadn't come to England yet. Caxton was his name, who sets up the first printing press. And so under Fisher's direction, she becomes celibate the rest of her life. She makes a vow of chastity for the rest of her life, and devotes herself basically to mass and prayer and alms and learning. And so she distributes a lot of royal money, with Fisher's direction on various projects for the benefit of the church. One of those is establishing a school of preachers, as it were. Now, there's like a myth that, oh yeah, medieval people, they didn't know the Bible, and they didn't know anything because they were all illiterate. They didn't read because they were illiterate, and they were illiterate because the economy of the time did not allow for the proliferation of books. So in turn, there's no demand for literacy because there's no possibility you're going to get your hands on a book unless you're very wealthy, because they're all copied out by hand. The printing press brings that price down a good bit, but not all the way. Books are still very expensive. They're a work of craft. They're sewn and bound in vellum, typically, which is calf skin or sheepskin sometimes, and and that's labor intensive. It's about 100 man hours to produce just a few sheets of vellum, right? And so a really complicated, very disgusting process, because of you'd have to be saving up urine to use for the ammoniates in it in order to use that to soak the hide, and then scrape off gradually all the hair off the calf's hide, and then or the cow's hide or what have you, and then just continue with that whole process until you've tanned essentially this nice soft sheet of leather that now can be written on. Or in this case, it was a very delicate one for wrapping around the boards that would make your book, right? And so and that's how things worked in those days. So the very expensive, and as a result, there's no demand for literacy because you couldn't afford a book. So how did people know the Bible? People actually knew the scripture better than probably any subsequent age, except I would say the 19th century, because they had, well, the usual explanation is they had stained glass windows, they had paintings, they had pictures, they had statues. That was only part of it. He's kind of forming this Biblia Pauperum, as it were, poor man's Bible, but it was the preaching that brought all of these images to life. It wasn't just the image itself, it was the preacher who brought these images to life, in frequent references that you can find, graffiti, other things, they all demonstrate a good knowledge of the content of the history of scripture, as well as in private devotion, the knowledge of Psalms, whether in Latin or in English. People knew these things. So they had a very solid knowledge of the content of the Bible and its meaning, because it was open for them by preaching. But one of the things that had happened in the 15th century, and actually even before, is the corruption in the episcopal absenteeism. Bishops are hanging out in court in some great city looking for favors, or in Rome looking for favors from the Pope, and any excuse to not do the work in their diocese. And but yet they'd have the money from their diocese to live on while they were abroad, which meant that nobody was really managing their diocese very effectively. And as a result, people were being brought to orders who did not have the capacity to preach. They were not receiving the faculty to it. And unless you had a steady supply of religious orders nearby who specialized in preaching, you didn't get preaching, maybe an Advent and a mission in Lent. And that would be about as much as you got. So this was a huge problem for the education of the people. And it's one that Margaret Beaufort thought she would remedy with John Fisher and several other priests of his choosing, who would go about preaching in the country in different places. Fisher would set down in a field and begin preaching on various subjects. One, of course, that we have in today published is his commentary in the 7 penitential Psalms, which is very good. He uses a lot of allusions even to classical antiquity, which the way he uses them show they were known to the people in some capacity. And again, the scriptural references and the histories, they all show that people had some knowledge of the scripture because of the way he said. He wouldn't just say it. It would be pointless to just reference a name and reference an event if the people had no knowledge of the event. Right. And so you could assume a wide knowledge of many of these events and reference them again, opening them up toward Christ and toward the virtues they needed to obtain or what have you. And so it was a marvelous effect, and he showed himself marvelously talented in this. And actually, he was a famous preacher, and he would preach all his days. In fact, the court would use him into great effect for that. But so then Henry VII, towards the end of his reign, the Diocese of Rochester opens up. Rochester was a very small diocese not far from London. And it was a stepping stone, as it were, to getting better, more plumb jobs, and that's how it was viewed. So nobody took its administration terribly seriously. Excuse me. Fisher, on the other hand, looks at that as his sacred office to do his utmost for this diocese. Now, there's a debate in the historical sources here whether Fisher refused any promotion in order to be devoted specifically to this diocese. The early biographer suggests this, and T.E. Bridget, in his very first biography of Fisher, repeats that. But other biographers aren't sure. The thought is it's spurious in that Fisher may very well have taken promotions, except later in Henry VIII's reign, he's blocked by Wolsey because Fisher was not suitably corrupt enough to move up. Because he was too holy, essentially, for the job, and I think that's rather insoluble which one it is. Mm-hmm. But given his holiness, that he wouldn't take a plumber job in order to devote himself to the poor diocese, that is at least very plausible. I mean, if we can't settle that for certain. So then the next thing that happens, so he takes the diocese. People think that, well, Lady Margaret Beaufort just got her chaplain made bishop. So Henry VII actually writes a letter to a courtier explaining that, no, I've done a lot bad in my reign, and I've observed Fisher's holiness and his goodness firsthand, and so I'm looking to remedy some of this the evil I have done by appointing such men as bishops.
Was he not being really sincere with that? Like what?
I think he was actually that he was sincere in trying to remedy some of what he had done. And so, he'd given substantial grants to Cambridge, where Fisher was also still a very important person. And then later he would rise to be the very chancellor of Cambridge itself, the University of Cambridge. Which is actually, it's ironic too, because that's also where a lot of the Protestantism in the country is hatched, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
Fisher then, oh yeah, go ahead, you have a question?
It just seems to me that most people have trouble understanding that people who do these bad things, especially leaders like this, will ever come to a sort of place in their life where they decide that they want to do better. I think so. Do you think our instincts there are normal, or do you think we've been corrupted by that?
It's hard to say. Sometimes people who are bad know to do the right thing. Christ himself alludes to this in the Sermon on the Mount. Who among you would give a serpent when your child asks for a fish? And if you who are evil know how to give good things, how much more your Father is in heaven, right? People who have mixed, complicated lives, messy lives, it doesn't mean that they have no desire whatsoever. So Henry VII is cruel, and he's parsimony, or he's what's the right word? He's stingy with money. He's looking to get as much wealth as he possibly can. He knows the price of everything and everyone. He's very cynical, but at the same time, he still has certain instincts that are very pious. His mother, of course, is very holy. So he looks at the reign as I've done these things. Yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that. And, maybe I was too harsh here. And who knows, moments of soul searching, or, well, this had to be done for the realm, but, I need to do something good for the church. And sometimes people who are very mixed, they have an instinct for what is right in certain things, and they'll do it. A man who's very positively wicked will still take his daughter out to do something, nice to make her happy. So it's so it just because he had been a miserly and a miserable king in some respects, doesn't mean that he didn't see something good that had to be done. So it's entirely plausible. And I don't think he would have written if because the thing is, like, there's a real etiquette and a protocol you have to follow. Lying explicitly like that is like in a written way anyway, is seen as unbecoming of a king. A king's not supposed to go back on his agreements because they're supposed to be sacred, because he's anointed. He's an anointed person. A king's not supposed to become overly familiar with commoners because he is the king. A king is not supposed to be that's the right word, going low with insults and responding to insults, because it's beneath his dignity. Right. So that's so that's another thing. I don't think Henry VII would have actually written to dispel that if if he didn't feel the need to. So it seems to me probably he may have even intended to promote Fisher higher. We'll never know, because when what happens in 1509 is Henry VII dies. Now, to backtrack a little bit for the Tudor reign, Henry has two sons. One is named Arthur, and the other, of course, the younger Henry. Arthur is a very conscious name choice. It's not anywhere in the family or in recent kings. It's hearkening back to the legends of King Arthur, which is so much of Wales in Welsh, the stronghold where the historical Arthur may have lived, and where in those times it was very much believed he did live, was in Wales. And so Henry's court moves very quickly to Wales in order that Arthur should be born there. And he was raised in Pembroke Castle. He was given a kingly education there. They have the Round Table, or what they think is the Round Table, which is set up by Edward the Third, and they in which Edward III claims then is the ancient Round Table they had discovered, and so they truly believed it was the Round Table, even though we know it was not. So, but it fit in with the lore and the legend, and it has so much to making the legend of kingship. So Arthur is very much has the notion of a restoration of something that is very distinctly English. And that's something with the Tudors. The Tudors were, Henry V was the first monarch that spoke English. The Tudors were the first English dynasty that made English the language of the court. A lot of people don't realize that. It's complete bubkiss, that line at the end of Shakespeare. But Shakespeare had no way to know this, of course, from his standpoint in time. But when he has in the end of the play, Henry V, that he can't speak to Catherine because she's speaking in French and he doesn't know French, it's nonsense. Henry V's first language was French, right? Anglo-Norman, right? But not unintelligible to the continental French. And that he had to learn English second. And that was the way all the English kings actually spoke French. The whole nobility was French. And so that even until the 1649, the Star Chamber, the King's Court, was conducted in Anglo-Norman. It was conducted in French. And so if you were a lawyer who practiced in the Star Chamber, you had to know Anglo-French. Otherwise, you couldn't practice. You didn't know. We even have an echo of this in our Supreme Court, which draws on these various traditions of the Anglo-Norman. Whenever the bailiff comes out and it cries, "Ouye, ouye, ouye," that's not even continental French. That's Anglo-Norman French, right? Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. It's what that means. And it's very much in its medieval spelling and everything. So so these are some of those traditions that come back. So Henry VII, anyway, is Arthur, and he gets very much involved with the Habsburgs. Henry gives a lot of money to Maximilian I. And this is actually a bit of knowledge I've only come across recently. I was listening to a historian talk about it, and I've been digging into some of the journals and the writings on this subject. And it's interesting, the Tudor connection to the Habsburgs is very strong. It's something that has not been studied very well before. But Henry, because Maximilian I is the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, he's always running out of money because he's got grand designs. He's trying to live like a Renaissance prince. He's but his position doesn't afford him enough money, and of course, constantly making war against the French in Italy, watching his borders against the Turks. It all costs a lot of money, and he starts hiring mercenaries, landsknechts. Excuse me. Which literally means foot knights or land knights. That word connect, you can see to the medieval pronunciation of the English knight, knicht, right? They were founded by a man named Martin von Frusberg, who's known as the father of the landsknechts. He was one of Maximilian I's agents, and so it is forming a core of private military that fought on the Swiss model with pike and shot. And they became very expensive because they realized, hey, them blue bloods, they need us, and they need to pay us a good deal. Otherwise, we're not going to fight. So Maximilian's always running out of money. And he's related. His son is Duke Philip the Good of the Netherlands, and his he's got he's married to Juana la Loca, who's known as Juana the Mad. She's the first daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And there's a relationship forms between them all. And so to add in to the buy-in to the Habsburg dynasty, Henry VII betroths his son Arthur to the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine of Aragon. And so they are duly married. And Henry, is young, but as soon as he sees her, he's madly in love with her. This beautiful Spanish princess of the whole idea of a Spanish princess. All his romantic tales, because Henry now is not given the same training that his older brother Arthur is receiving. He is not expected to be a king because he's the spare. In Margaret Beaufort's Book of Hours, she has a calendar where she's written, and you can still observe this in the British Library. She has a Book of Hours that has the dates when important things happen. So 1492 is Henry's date, and she has it crossed out and replaced because originally it was Henry, Duke of York. Now she has to change. She goes back and changes it once Arthur dies to change it, to scribble it out and write instead, King Henry, Prince of Wales was born, because he was not meant to be a king. He was meant to be the spare. And so he's raised with his sisters. His mother teaches him how to write. His very first, education was given by his mother. He's growing up on knightly tales, romantic tales. He's preparing for the joust. When Perkin Warbeck and the pretender pretending to be Richard, Duke of York, comes up with his Welsh army, largely, he, Henry is placed in the Tower for safekeeping, and then his father decides to create him as Duke of York and formally induct him as a knight. And this fits in perfectly with these romantic, adventures he has in reading, excuse me, and saving fair ladies and what have you. Now he is truly a knight, commissioned to be made a true Duke of York against the counterfeit Duke of York, right? And this is how he's raised in his upbringing. John Fisher is actually brought in to help Henry VIII with his Latin. And Henry actually is a very good linguist. He's fluent in Latin, in Spanish, in French. He's very proud of the fact that he's taught French by an actual Frenchman. And so he speaks very good continental French. And we know Henry enjoyed writing in French. He actually, love letters to Anne Boleyn were written in French, which the ones that are at the Vatican, actually, we'll get to that. There's a story about that. So they're in the Vatican Library. I've seen them before, actually.
That's funny.
The key is, Henry is his all-around Renaissance prince. So then tragedy strikes. Arthur dies, and it's not known why he died. And of course, then there's the question of whether or not the marriage was consummated. And this is all very confusing for modern people because the church doesn't treat this the same way. But if you are an in-law, it is within the rank of consanguinity by law. Now, so you're a kin by law, not by fact. But it doesn't matter. It's treated precisely the same. So marrying your brother's wife is like marrying your sister in a certain way. And so you need to, but it's only in law. So therefore, because it's in law, it can be dispensed. And that's the issue that will come up, of course. Was she truly his brother's wife, or was the marriage not consummated and therefore not valid? And this is something that will come up during the King's Great Matter. Here's the other thing that happens as well. So Henry VII had to seek a dispensation from Julius II in order for Henry to marry Catherine. And he's already setting up that betrothal to keep that Spanish arrangement going. But then Isabella does not like the language in the bull that recognizes her as a princess dowager, as having actually been married and having actually consummated the marriage. And so she seeks a bull from Julius II, Pope Julius II, that would say that Catherine was in fact a virgin still, and he grants it. To add, and of course, there's no investigation that's done for this. It's merely on the assertion of one of the greatest monarchs in Christendom at the time, and he puts it in. And so, whether or not it's true, I do take Catherine's side, but whether or not that was actually consummated or not, it's questionable. We'll delve into that towards the end. So anyway, so Henry VII kind of starts dragging his feet, not sure if he's going to allow this marriage to happen. He's kind of souring on the whole Spanish thing, thinking about maybe allying with the French, who knows. And then he dies, and his reign comes to an end, and Henry sets aside 3 years of torturous negotiation in but 3 days and manages to get all the necessary things in order and marries Catherine, and for love. And so in 1509, the coronation, Henry decides to have a joint coronation. It's great parade. Unfortunately, it rains on them as they're going. But it goes around, and as it swings around the London boroughs toward the London borough of Cheapside, a young lawyer for the London boroughs begins to address Henry and speaks of the passing away of our slavery, which is actually very daring because he's basically commenting negatively on his father's reign. But fortunately, he knew his man because Henry was very pleased by that. And this lawyer continues that we're entering a new golden age. Now begins a time of joy, for our king does not love gold and jewels. And indeed, look at our queen, who is going to be the mother of kings, as in she's going to be very bounteous and very fruitful. And this reign is going to be, a new age, for a golden age for England. Well, he's wrong on both counts. And this man was sir, or not sir yet, but Thomas More. Now, More was born in 1478, about 10 years after Fisher, also during the reigns of Richard III, and then later Henry Tudor. More was, lived in London borough by Bucklesbury. And he lived in a place called the Barge, because you had to take a barge to get to it. It was formerly a grocer's building that had gradually been annexed, and various parts of it turned into lodging. And so some of which is kept open to be a great hall. There's actually descriptors for it not too long after More's death. And so we have a good idea of what it looked like when More lived there. But and so we don't know a whole lot about More's very early life. Except again, he would have received the same education as John Fisher. His father, John More, was a lawyer, also sheriff's undersecretary. He had gone to different positions in the court. Eventually would make it to the King's Bench as a judge prior to his death. So he raised his son to also go into law. And More, for a time, became very attached to attorneys. He started learning Greek. Now, Greek was very much a new study. It had been lost after the fall of the Roman Empire through the Middle Ages. The knowledge of Greek gradually passes away outside of Italy, and then even in Italy itself. And so you have, it comes back during the period of the Renaissance, and one of the catalysts for spreading the knowledge of the Greek language around Europe was the fall of Constantinople, which brought many Greek scholars over to Italy in order to earn their bread, teaching young Italian humanists Greek. And that one of the things that spurs on much of the humanist movement. So More learns Greek and becomes absolutely devoted to his reading and writing and translating Greek poetry all the time. And his father's like, knock that off, get back to law. Eventually, it works, upon him. His father married, I think, about 4 times, if I'm not mistaken, and it was a common thing, but it was new for the middle class to be doing this, marrying a lot of rich widows to try to advance his career. And he got more than he bargained for when he married Joan Marshall, who was very much a very fiery woman, ill-tempered, and made him pay for wanting to use her money and her dowry. So as John More. So Thomas rises up, and he's very brilliantly trained. He goes to Oxford. He takes his degrees, I believe, 1498, if I'm not mistaken. And so he spends some time with the Carthusians, and to test his vocation, and he discerns that this is not actually where I'm supposed to go. There's actually a long-running debate of whether he was a third order Franciscan. The Franciscans claim him, and they have him on their calendar as a third order Franciscan.
Really?
Actually, and they hold his feast today. It's highly doubtful historically how it seems that More did have some involvement, but he was not formally enrolled in any accounts of the time. It could be lost, it's true. And so there's a debate about whether he really was a third order Franciscan, but nevertheless, there was a decree from the Congregation of Saints which lists him as the third order Franciscan. So there he is, whether he was or not. If I always notice the Franciscans are always pulling in anybody they can. Somebody who once heard a Franciscan preach but died as a Benedictine is on their calendar as a lay Franciscan. So I mean,
that's funny.
But anyway, it's nevertheless. So More gets married and begins his law practice, as well as humanist studies, and he has a great circle around him. His very young wife Joanna gives him all his children. His oldest daughter Margaret, etc., down to his younger son John, and he has quite a circle around him. One of the biggest things that happens is Erasmus of Rotterdam comes to England and makes More's acquaintance. So Erasmus, he's a very colorful figure, very interesting figure. Again, we could do a whole podcast on Erasmus, and so I've got to cut it short. But Erasmus is somebody who shouldn't exist.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition, and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle, or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10.
So Erasmus is the son of a priest, and so he's somebody that should not exist. And as a result, he's sent off to the monastery. And where he's raised, he becomes very brilliant in Latin. He's very entrepreneurial, he's enterprising, and he becomes a humanist scholar. He escapes the monastery to become a secretary of Latin letters in Paris. And then he starts working at the university and getting on various projects, editing works, getting works from manuscript into print of the church fathers, classical writers. And that was a big thing at that time. And of course, editing and correcting a manuscript, getting these things to be accurate, right? This is so much the work. And so he became very much a humanist. And one of the things, so humanists looked in two ways. One, to that ancient age of Greece and Rome, as it's close to perfection as you could get without the light of the gospel. And so to recover towards the perfection of what man can do, aided by God's grace. It's very different from modern day secular humanism. And the second thing was very much ad fontes, as it were, going back to the sources of Greece and Rome in literature and writing, and also in the church amongst the early church fathers. So you have writers in Italy who are doing this, like Lorenzo Valla, for example, and some of them are very skeptical about certain elements of church teaching. And they looking back in the early church, say, well, hey, this means this, not this. The Greek says this. And so like one example is in the Gospel of Luke. The Vulgate says to do penance, but the Greek says turn your life around, literally. And so, which is translated in Latin as penitemini, and do penance. And it becomes very much in commentaries the basis of the church's system of penances and so many things. So the humanists are trying to challenge that by saying, well, look, it doesn't say do penance, it says change your life. I mean, none of that really undercuts the church's teaching on doing penance, but they thought it did, and they thought they had a good argument there. So, and so they would write and comment on these things and make arguments against various things based on, again, going ad fontes, right? Not unlike the Ressourcement movement in the 30s, which is a similar type of idea, ad fontes, where they're, again, trying to undercut so much of church teaching by going back to the sources, as it were, but oftentimes actually cherry picking the sources for their own particular interest in moves, and or introducing doubt where there's actually certainty, where the church has decreed something, but then this one obiter dicta in this Greek fathers is this, so therefore we don't know. Yes, you do, actually, and you're an idiot. But these guys are celebrated as the most wonderful people, so you can't criticize them. Anyway, so I'm going to leave off of that before I get you canceled. Especially if we talk about Delubach, I'm not going to talk about him. Let's get back to Erasmus, who is doing similar things to that. Erasmus has this idea of a pure Christianity, getting back to the early church. Let's get rid of all scholasticism. Let's wipe it off the map. And let's go back to the church fathers, make Origen the chief of all church fathers, and and then follow that. And he had received a lot of criticism, rightly so, because the argument was, well, wait, the especially in Louvain and other places that debated Erasmus on this subject, and they said, well, the scholastics labored on problems which the church fathers had never thought about. You can't throw them all out, right? Erasmus writes a number of things, and that's why the joke is that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. And so that a lot of his criticism and questioning of the church, Erasmus did not believe the papacy was a divine institution, for example. He believed it was a human institution, which was necessary for ordering the church, but was not actually divine. and very much needed reform, and which is true enough that it needed reform. But and so while he's teaching in Paris and in Louvain, he meets one Lord Mountjoy. I can't remember his first name. Lord Blount is the Lord Mountjoy. He comes over. He brings Erasmus with him over to England. Erasmus, of course, is always in need of money, and to meet the higher, wealthier circle that is in England. And so, and as he meet in 1499, he meets Thomas More on a second trip to England, and they become fast friends and talking very late into the night. The young Henry VIII, when he's about 8 years old, More is a familiar of the court, and this is the first time he meets Henry when Henry's about 8, and he goes to a birthday party for the young Henry and brings Erasmus along, and he failed to tell Erasmus that it was a birthday party and he needed to provide a gift. So the young Henry VIII writes Erasmus a note challenging him for some verses from his pen, which Erasmus labors on very mightily and presents to him, and then doesn't get a present for his trouble. And that's the first introduction of Erasmus to Henry, as well as Thomas More. So the two become friends, but More's legal work, takes him out and about. So then Margaret More could remembered Erasmus, kind of laboring about the house. He only speaks, Dutch and German, and More only doesn't speak those, and so they have to talk in Latin. And his wife, therefore, cannot, communicate with him. Also, Erasmus is just kind of busying about. He's mad that his books haven't showed up from Italy and all these things, but he's getting free room and board at More's house. And then another fellow shows up named Ammonio, who's an Italian humanist, eventually gets a job as Henry VIII's Secretary of Letters, but he's also hanging around quite a bit around More's house. And so the for free room and board, right? So More continues for a good time doing his jobs, and he also trains and educates his daughter, which is unusual for men of that time. And he makes sure that they're trained with also a brilliant humanist education. And of course, it's funny, his daughters take to it and become better scholars than his son. His son is taciturn. He's not really interested. He does become a lawyer, but he's not a great scholar, which is much to More's chagrin. He would rather, but he very much loved his daughters. And then tragedy strikes. His wife dies, Joanna, after not too long after the birth of their son, John. It was probably influenza, although typhoid couldn't be ruled out, or dysentery. Probably wasn't the plague or the sweating sickness, because this fellow Ammonio, who was basically living high on the hog on Moore's dime, he would have been out of there if it was. So, and he has the indecency to stick around. This Italian Erasmus was out, at Oxford, and had moved on to Cambridge, which we'll get to. That's how he meets John Fisher. But so More then, is in mourning. Is a terrible tragedy for Margaret, especially. She has to, she's a little girl, and then there's her mom going 6 feet into the ground. And More does very much like his father. He marries within a month, and the woman he marries is Alice Middleton. So, like a lot of rich heiresses, Middletons were merchant class, and they had a lot of wealth and possessions, and so a lot of all that was left to Alice. Why More settled on her, we don't know. We don't get a lot of information on this, but they marry, and it was very much what More needed. There's this persistent myth that More and his second wife Alice did not get along, and it's based on two things. One is on Erasmus didn't like her, and two, on what happens at the end, where she doesn't understand why he won't swear the royal supremacy, and she tries to push him to do so, and so the people take from that she just didn't like. And it's not true. It's when you actually get in the sources and in the letters and in Moore's anecdotes about marriage, or even about his own life, you find that it's exactly the opposite. They had a very warm and close relationship, and they were very opposite each other, but she really did square the circle of his life. More was a scholar, but he's also full of mirth. He's witty, he's joyful, it's great to have at parties, he dances. Alice Middleton is also witty and sarcastic with dry humor. She's like the very realization of Lucian's satire, a woman in Lucian's satire, right? The ancient Greek satirist. And she gave as good as she got, right? And she was very much the equal to More in terms of wit, even though she comes from a very different world. She is streetwise, she is competent in handling money. More is not. More, of course, has these fellows who are there for bed and board. So the first thing she does is boot this fellow Ammonio out of the house. And it's the problem is he's the one who's there to view all the events from Joanna's death to Moore's marrying Alice. And he's the absolute worst source you could possibly get because he's mad because he just got kicked out of free room and board and as much wine as he could ask for. And so he has all nasty things to say about her. And it's impossible to verify any of them by any of the sources because it's, he's a very a biased party in the whole thing. Right. So there's so many tales too about More and his wife getting along in different ways and having discussions and the sarcasm. And it's clear that they loved each other and they got along well. And More, of course, loved his family. There's this fellow Jasper really tries to make it look like More never didn't care about his family, hated his family. And it's where some of the myth about his wife come in. They all got along very famously. And he very much loved his daughters. There's a time when he was talking to the Duke of Norfolk, and he had a letter. And he's like, I just have to show you this letter that my daughter wrote. And it's written in Latin. And he's showing how perfect her writing is and her style and her diction. And he's so pleased with it. And then another letter falls out and he says, what's that? Well, this is from my other daughter. This one's from my wife, and so on and so forth. So he was very much a family man, but he's drawn away more and more on business. Yeah. And like we mentioned, he's chosen by the city of London to give a speech to Henry VIII's coronation as it rides by. And so he had known Henry, when Henry was young. He'd been to the court. Excuse me, he'd been to the court several times. And so he was known to Henry at this time, but they weren't quite fast friends yet. That's for later. So More is, he becomes an under sheriff, and he does his job with aplomb and dignity. He does his job extremely well, and everyone just sings his praises. He starts settling complicated discussions in law between various parties. The woolers guilds in Antwerp are mad with the city of London about all kinds of fees and export duties and all these things that they all have to pay. And so More works on the compromises for them. And of course, increasingly now he's gone from home, which is not what he really wants to be doing. And so as time rolls by, he's noticed by Henry, principally because there's a issue where there's a massive amount of alum. Alum is a particular mineral that is only found at the time in the Papal States. And so the popes have a monopoly on it. And there's a whole couple of shiploads of alum that certain merchants were using without paying the Pope his fees. And so More is the one who comes on the compromise that makes everybody happy, including Pope Leo X. And Henry also, then he comes to the notice of Henry and Wolsey. And this is how he becomes a member of the court. Let's backtrack to Henry. So Henry ascends the throne in 1509, at barely 18, and marries Catherine for love. But then, he's the first thing he wants to do is he's throwing parties, he's giving grants, he loves just giving away money and giving away things. And one of the first things, though, is he needs to get more money. And so he wants, Lady Margaret Beaufort dies, and Fisher preaches, of course, the sermon on her death. And just as he did for Henry VII, actually was chosen to preach for Henry VII's eulogy. And it speaks very differently for Margaret Beaufort than for Henry, and all the praise of women and virtuous and holy women, likening her to various figures in Scripture. And now, of course, now came the time for the will, and she had gave Fisher a lot of money to found a college specifically for the training of priests. Fisher will go on to set it up, and he'll set up St. John's College, Cambridge, which you can still see today. It still has the marvelous entrance that Fisher himself would have viewed being built. And it was basically a seminary before its time, in all but name, even before the Council of Trent, specifically for training priests with regulation and so on and so forth. And like we mentioned, Fisher, of course, becomes a very holy bishop. He's preaching to the people. He says, if I don't preach, I'll be damned. Right. And we'll talk about his residence when we get toward the end. But Henry then wants all that money that Margaret Beaufort left him. So Fisher fights him in the court in order to get that money because it was given for him. And eventually, Henry makes an agreement that he would still want some of it but he wants to avoid the embarrassment of the courts finding in favor of the church. So Fisher then, gets on the hit list. He was an intimate of the court of his father, but now no more. Henry makes his disfavor clearly known. And for Fisher, it's fine. I'm going to be a bishop. I don't care. So Henry runs into that. He has all his father's advisors. Archbishop Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop Fox, the Bishop of Winchester, and several others. And so one of the things that Henry wants to do is he idolizes Henry V and Edward, the Black Prince of Wales. He wants to restart the 100 Years' War and claim the crown of France. And this is what Henry absolutely wants to do. The problem is the France he's facing off against is a much different France, much more organized, better equipped than the one that his ancestors defeated. So, he's looking for an excuse to go to war. And of course, war was brewing. You have the Italian wars, and the Pope had made an alliance in the League of Cambrai, moved the League of Cambrai to fight against the French. And so they came, to England, looking, banging on, knocking on the door. And Henry was, of course, very willing, but his advisors did not want to go to war. So, and Henry is very non-confrontational. He doesn't like to look you in the eyes. He's nervous, even though he's a king and he's supposed to be confident, and he has great mirth, towering height. He's young, he's handsome, he's thin, right? Not the image we get from the later in the reign, which most are familiar with. Is one of the most handsome fix in England. He is, great at jousting and so many things, but his council forbids it. We don't want you jousting. So they send an almoner, one of Fox's almoners, a man named Thomas Wolsey, to look after Henry. Now, Wolsey is the son of an Ipswich innkeeper. He was usually on the wrong side of the law. He's in the local Ipswich records, actually, for keeping an unclean house, and fined several times. Or not he, but his father. And so Wolsey wants to escape this kind of life. And so he, again, goes to the free grammar schools. He becomes brilliant in Latin, goes to university, takes his degrees, enters the church. And of course, he was more cut out for state service. So here he is as his almoner, kind of keeping an eye on Henry. And he slowly realizes that the way to favor is to get Henry what he wants. And so and notice that Henry defies the council and jousts and, is celebrated for it. So he decides to help Henry with things. One of the biggest things is getting rid of the way in which his father's counselors kept control on him, the course of the seals, right? You had the Lord High Chancellor had to, keep, seal a document, and then, another secretary. And if he refused to do it, technically you didn't become law. Henry, to get around this, I mean, it's a convention. Henry could have, but he just doesn't want to do it. So Wolsey helps him figure it out. Let's call BS on the whole thing. And because it is just a convention. And so he has Henry make some appointment, and the exchequer or the secretary refuses to do it, and Wolsey is the one who pushes it through and just cites various legal precedent. This is a convention. It goes back to Henry II, of course, and and Henry gets rid of it. And now and so the advisors, Archbishop Warham and Fox, they resign, and Wolsey is now placed in a very prominent position, and eventually he becomes the Lord High Chancellor because he got Henry what he wanted, and the principal thing he wants is war with France. And so he gets an army together, departs, sees Catherine. Of course, Catherine had miscarried with a son, which he was very upset about. First, actually, no, the son died after childbirth. I'm sorry, first son. And so he's upset, but they spend the night together in Plymouth before they set off, and they make their way to France, where Henry has tremendous victories against the French in Terouanne and other cities. And Terouanne particularly, they call it the Battle of the Spurs, because while the English were besieging, the French attempted to relieve the city by throwing stuffs of food over the side of the walls, and the English routed them so that all you could see was their spurs retreating. So they called it the Battle of the Spurs derisively against the French. And Henry took the city. And it seemed like he was on his way, but taking the city was one thing. And of course, under Louis XII now, aged, Henry was depending on his allies. Ferdinand, who was Catherine's father, was supposed to take Spanish forces and attack the French from the south. And he went and he took Navarre and he called it a day. And which made Henry very ticked off.
Yeah.
And we'll see what he does later. So these wars kind of continue, and Henry finds this enormous cost of maintaining this garrison in Terouanne, so deep into French territory. So eventually he makes a deal with the French and he gives it back, and he goes back to England. But he still tries to make a propaganda plan, and Wolsey, as spin doctor in chief, declares Henry to be, the arbiter of Europe. He decides if the French go to Italy or no. Well, the political situation changes. A newer, younger, handsome, athletic, and about 3 inches taller than Henry, Francois, the Count of Angoulême, becomes Francois I of France. And he's very much a Renaissance prince. He brings the Renaissance to France. He's a humanist. He collects all these mostly criminal Italian humanists of some degree, like Cellini the goldsmith, who was wanted for a rape and a couple of murders. But he was a brilliant goldsmith. Don't get me wrong. He was an absolutely brilliant gold and silversmith. He do wonders with that. Da Vinci, who was wanted in connection with some bad behavior in Florence, in terms of the alphabet people type of stuff. You had a few other people that were just not terribly great people, but as long as they behaved themselves, they could stay at court in France. And of course, Da Vinci distinguishes himself in the French court with so many things. That's why the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre and not in some museum in Italy, is because he brings it with him, right? And so on and so forth. But so Francois calls Henry's bluff. He goes to Italy and he says, "Try to stop me." And Henry knew he didn't have the money or the means. And so and this was a problem for his view of himself in the European stage. Henry is very much make England great again in Europe, instead of being some backwater country that they don't care about. The other thing that's interesting that happens is that, so while Henry is gone fighting in France, Catherine is technically in charge of the country, and the Scots take the opportunity to invade. And so Catherine, gets the armies assembled together. King James V is killed on the field of battle, and dies, and they take his coat of arms and everything. So it was actually a better victory than Henry's. Shines him, right? So Henry comes back. She's pregnant again, and everything's looking on the up. Until this business with the French, and then of course Catherine miscarries. So Henry and Wolsey are looking for something. They want to have this peace conference of sorts with the French, something for Henry to get on the international stage. It wasn't as expensive as fighting a war. And so they arranged this spectacle, this really absurd spectacle, the Field of the Cloth of Gold, and which was kind of like an Olympics / UN G7, what have you, kind of conference at the time. Yeah. And where Henry and Francois, they get together. The English built like a makeshift city, and all their tents are made out of cloth of gold. It's just an amazing spectacle, which now today is an empty field that just has a little signpost to mark the occasion. But then it would have been full of tents and pavilions, and so jousting and tilting, and the English had gotten the better of so many of the games. Henry had to spoil it by challenging Francois to a wrestling match, which Francois won, unfortunately for Henry, even though Henry was very tall, very handsome and athletic. So nevertheless, they signed perpetual peace. So the Venetian ambassador, oh merciful heavens, what was his name? Well, anyway, it's in Robert Brown's accounts Venetian, with all the discourse there for this date. The Venetian ambassador, it jokes about the period, about the whole thing. He says, these men hate each other. What peace are they actually talking about? And sure enough, Henry and Francois signed the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. And 3 weeks later, Henry meets the new Emperor Charles V and promises to make war against France the next year. Present on this occasion were both St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. So Fisher was present as Queen Catherine of Aragon's chaplain, which role he filled from time to time. She had several royal chaplains, and Fisher very often would would be called in, especially for if she had more complicated questions or things that had to be done. So he's there with her as a chaplain. It's the only time he's known to have left the country. And St. Thomas More also as an advisor, because at this point he's been included in Henry's court. So, this kind of creates a more complicated situation for Henry, as he's got to come up with the money, but he does, and he gets his army together. Charles V, promises to make war. He comes to England itself, and he promises Henry the Moon. He'll make Cardinal Wolsey Pope. He will do all these things and repay all the debts that Ferdinand owed, and so many things. And they'll both crush France together. And Henry, who's the heir, of course, to the Habsburg alliance created by his father, again looks at that and decides to assist. And of course, even after Henry breaks from the church, he'll still lean more towards the Habsburgs than he will towards the French. So, but Henry VIII and Francois and Charles V, the King of Spain and the Empire, as well as the Netherlands and so many other places, they're all in a perpetually stabbing each other in the back, like a 3-ring circus of guys with knives. Really, it's a promising peace this year, making war the next year, and so on and so forth. Henry helps Charles land in Spain to put down the Comuneros revolt. Last time we talked about how that whole revolt accidentally creates Ignatius of Loyola.
Yeah.
And during that time, and so Henry's still very much powerful in the European stage. And now we should talk about Catherine. So she has been perpetually pregnant for years. She has one surviving daughter, Mary, who at the time when Charles V comes to London, Mary is actually betrothed to Charles V, even though she's 6. And that becomes very much the problem. That's why Charles will break that betrothal, because she's 6 and he'd have to wait for another 6 or 7 years. But he's very eager to get an heir right now.
Yeah.
So it became a betrothal of convenience. And then, of course, he marries an Austrian nobility, and that solves that problem for him. But in the meantime, all these words breaking up. But Catherine, she's kind of lost her usefulness, it seemed. She knew Henry was having mistresses, but now this new alliance with Charles V, it gave her importance again. She's now included in so many things, because she was by this time 40, and it was clear she was not going to have children. Henry was still in his prime. Okay.
Yeah.
And she's worn out. What happens to a woman who's perpetually pregnant? Of course, they're not quite as attractive as when they were 22.
Yeah.
And this is the problem that Henry's facing, and why he's turning to so many mistresses, which of course is not to defend it, but that's the psychology that's going on.
Sure.
Right. And so now, she's important again until it all falls apart. Henry puts troops in the field in 1523. Charles never shows up. Henry puts troops in the field in 1524. The Duke of Surrey is within striking distance of Paris. Charles never shows up. And then 1525. Henry says, nah, I'm going to sit it out. Charles gets the striking victory over the French at the Battle of Pavia, and he takes Francois I captive. Henry finds out, and he's like, oh, and he had no troops in the field. And so he writes to Charles V and says, congratulating him on his victory, and says, why don't we, partition France together? And Charles, of course, just captured his great rival. He doesn't want to create another one. So he tells Henry, well, if you want your bit of France, you're going to have to conquer it yourself. Henry scrambles to get the money. Parliament will not give another grant, because the way it worked in those days is tax breaks were permanent and tax increases were temporary. The monarch only raised taxes typically to fight war. It doesn't now. People did have to pay feudal dues and all these things. It's not like people paid no taxes, but they didn't pay the kind of exorbitant taxes we pay today to support a state, because the king supported on his own revenue. There's no difference between what he spends on a thing of state and some trinket for the queen or what have you. So Henry needs the money desperately to raise the troops. It's very expensive, and the commons will not vote an increase in taxes, because we're still paying off much of the tax burden for the Field of the Cloth of Gold and for so many other things. So Wolsey, again, a spin doctor in chief, decides to make Henry to get a forced loan. Forced loan is essentially, you're going to pay up on penalty of treason this money that the king needs right now. And he called it the amicable grant.
Amicable.
It was anything but amicable. The nobility grumbled, many protested, but what was worse is the peasantry were protesting because they knew it would be taken out of them to give it to the dukes and earls and what have you to pay Henry. And so it was so unpopular. It was the most unpopular, period in Henry's reign. So he decides to call the whole thing off. Alas, I will never be successful in Europe. I'm just going to have to accept it. And if Henry died right then, he would have been a king who tried to make England grand on the map and had failed. And now something else, happens entirely. Right. And so More and Fisher, now they're relative places. So Fisher, again, is an important personage, partly because of his theological standing. He's written various treatises on Luther. He becomes known as the greatest theologian in Christendom. That's how he quickly becomes regarded. Fisher's first literary output was against a humanist named Lefebvre. Lefebvre argued in favor of the Eastern view on Mary Magdalene, that she's actually three different people. The person in Scripture that, the adulterous woman and so on and so forth, whereas the Latin tradition holds she's one.
Yeah.
Right? She's all one person. And, and that's still an open question. Yeah, right. It's people act like, oh yeah, the Eastern tradition's got it. There's good arguments from both sides. Fisher, I wish I had the time. I'd love to translate Fisher's book on this. So he writes a whole book on it, and this is the first time that he and Thomas More are known to correspond. Although they must have met each other at some point or have known each other. A friend of mine paints this picture because they were both very good friends of Erasmus of Rotterdam. And so a friend of mine wrote a book depicting them all as sitting around the fire talking, which is a wonderful image, but there's no evidence that actually happened.
It's in a book, did you say?
What's that?
What book?
Oh, it's called Heroes and Heretics of the Reformation by Philip Campbell. And he doesn't assert it as fact. He writes it, one can imagine, right?
Sure.
And it's a great image, but it's probably not true because one, More and Fisher ran in different circles. Fisher's much younger. He's a young layman running in scholarly circles. Fisher is mostly amongst ecclesiastics, and those who know him well know he can be very warm and full of mirth and joy. Once you get through the exterior, which is more guarded on the outside. And so he doesn't make fast friends, but once he makes friends, he's friends for life, typically. But so More, they didn't know each other, except possibly professionally. Like I said, they were both present in the field of cloth of gold with Henry. But they certainly, this is the first time that More has a direct writing to Fisher to congratulate him on writing this book, which is written in such good Latin. And it argues the point so well, he says it's almost like 10 Erasmuses had written it. And then comes the next place where Henry tries to make his splash on the European scene. Although this starts before Pavia, but Martin Luther, and now we're just taking this from the English perspective, had appeared in the continent, attacking the Church's sacraments, attacking her theology, and now was gaining a good bit of followers and starting a new schism. Right. And Henry decided to distinguish himself by writing against Luther in defense of the seven sacraments. So he gets information, input from various theologians, including Fisher, but then he composes the book himself, and he has More as his secretary. Now, there's some people who believe that Fisher actually wrote the treatise of the seven sacraments, but it's actually not true. It's Henry's propaganda from 1535 that tries to lay that on Fisher. First, they tried to lay it on More, but More says, "I've got all the evidence to prove I didn't do that," because it was because of the preface. The preface gives this thundering defense of the papacy as the supreme Lord on earth. But in 1535, it's a huge embarrassment to Henry, who's broken with the Pope and no longer considers him the supreme Lord on earth. So now what do we do with that? And so they blame Fisher for it. And then the propaganda is so effective. The Antwerp editors of Fisher's Opera Omnia are confused about whether Fisher wrote it. So they include it anyway as a dubious work. But when you read the book in Latin, and then you read Fisher's theological treatises, it's very clear that they're different authors. Henry, the treatise, The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, is clearly the work of a layman, albeit a well-educated layman. It's not argued like a theologian, right? And you can see that's the difference between reading the two. So Henry, in this defense of the seven sacraments, lays out all the places where Luther erred, but the preface is the one that attracts the most attention because of later events, because he declares the Pope to be the supreme Lord on earth. So More, who was a disciple of Erasmus, and actually believed in conciliarism because he didn't realize it had been condemned. Because, council comes out and you don't see those documents for years or hear about them. But Lateran V had formally condemned conciliarism, the idea that the council can judge a pope. So More believed this, not knowing that it had been condemned. And he believed the papacy was a human institution, not a divine one, just like Erasmus. And so he says to Henry, my lord, you might want to leave that bit out, right? As he's editing and putting together, everything for the book, and he sees this preface. And Henry says, well, why? And he says various things to Henry, about English law and, what happens if you and the Pope should get in some great conflict. And Henry's not at all disturbed about this because Henry believes that papacy is a divine institution. More does not. Whereas that will completely reverse in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
Right? Because More, like, going through this humanist training, really believe this. And so Henry pushes through, and we'll get to what changes more. But Henry pushes this through, and then you get to when the Pope sees the book, he dedicates it specifically to Pope Leo X. Leo X is just all thrilled that a monarch of Christendom has written such a learned book. And so he gives him the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, which the English monarchs keep to this day, even though it was not meant to be a hereditary title. It's actually clear from the bull conceding the title was not meant to be hereditary.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it becomes so. And it usurped to an entirely different sense, because Fidei Defensor of 1535 is the defender of the Ecclesia Anglicana, the English church, which Henry is the head of, right? Excuse me. So, but at this time, it's not. So the official papal commendation comes in. Henry VI, so he can't appear. So Wolsey has the book, and John Fisher is chosen to preach against the damnable doctrines of Martin Luther and at St. Paul's Cross. And as he's in, they burn Lutheran books. And as he's preaching, he stops and alludes to the book that our king has just written. And as he gestures toward Wolsey, who's holding up the book, and great cheers and applause. And had Henry been there, there'd been a lot more applause, a lot more cheering. But nevertheless, Colonel Wolsey is a complicated figure. I haven't talked a whole lot about him, except how he got there. Wolsey is a very crafty churchman. Henry decides to increase his authority by appealing to the Pope to make him a cardinal a latere. And so that now, he becomes English and yet a papal representative. He's basically the Pope's man in England. As such, he usurps the role that the Archbishop of Canterbury should have. And Warham is largely a passive person, and he lets Wolsey dominate over him. And because he knows Wolsey's got the king's authority, and he's afraid of upsetting the king, so he's going to let Wolsey kind of run roughshod over things. Wolsey manages the situation for Henry. And he does so by preventing the formation of factions at court. And so when too many of the gentlemen of the bedchamber are seeming to exercise political influence, Wolsey creates an office for them to be special knights and sends them off to France, right? And, he's clever, always managing the affairs for Henry. And as long as he gets Henry what he wants, he can get away with it. And Henry's not terribly concerned about it. And so this is the the crux that puts Wolsey in such a position, but also demands more and more in the way of return. And if he can't get it, well, it's not going to be very good. And Wolsey runs into this crisis, in the beginning of the king's great matter, right? And so because Anne Boleyn comes in, and now she brings faction back to court, and Wolsey cannot control it or organize it. And this is really the problem. So Fisher, like I said, becomes this great theologian. He writes many books against Luther in Latin. Very few have been translated. I've got someone who's working on it piecemeal because I can't afford to get his whole rate while I do other things. So hopefully one day those will show up in English, because they're really good. They were actually used at the Council of Trent in formulating their decrees against Luther, because it was the most systematic refutation of Luther that had been done.
Right? Yeah. Are most of Fisher's work not translated?
Yeah, most of his Latin works. So he has the defense of the royal assertion against the abominable heresies of Martin Luther, and against the book De Babylonica Captivitate is the title. They get these big long titles in those days. So Luther wrote the book on the Babylonian captivity, where he asserts that first he starts asserting there's 3 sacraments, then he jumps down to 2. and attacks the entire system, argues that the true sacraments have been locked in this Babylonian captivity of Antichrist, right? Then he, and he writes a book, of course, attacking. In that book, he attacks, the Eucharist, not the Eucharist as such, but the Catholic piety toward the Eucharist and the priesthood. He argues, asserts there's merely this common priesthood of believers, and there's no special priesthood by order, what have you. So Fisher writes 2 books, like I said, against the Babylonian captivity that defends the sacraments, and secondly, in defense of the holy priesthood. Now that one is in translation, Against the Priesthood. I actually sell it, not to grift so much right now, but mediatrixpress.com for that, Defense of the Holy Priesthood by Fisher. Then he writes another one, he held off for a couple of years because he heard a report that Luther might recant, but when it didn't happen, he let go. And so he published. So Luther asserted numerous articles, and these articles we have the core of his teaching. It's the basis of which, most of which forms in the bull Exsurge Domine, where Leo X condemns Luther. Then Luther says, well, heck with that. He burns the bull Exsurge Domine, burns the entire corpus of canon law, and he reasserts the articles that were all condemned. So this is called the assertion of the articles. And so Fisher takes the assertion of the articles word by word, and, quotes Luther in full, and then makes massive refutations, about 800 pages in the Latin.
Wow.
So it's big, dense pages. It's very long, but it's also the key to Fisher's teaching on virtually every subject. You can find in there. So it's very useful. I've used it many times in working out his theology. If you don't know Latin, there's a good book, although it's a very expensive book, by Richard Rex. I believe he's at Cambridge. I can't remember, but he wrote a book on this subject, on John Fisher. There is another one, if you can find it, because it's out of print, The Works and Days of John Fisher, both of which delve deeply into the theology of Fisher. So if you don't know Latin, then that's the source I would go to get in that, until those books finally make their way into translation. So, but anyway, so that's part of why he's a celebrated figure. So now, Henry, of course, as I mentioned, is soured on Catherine, and he still respects her. She's still a very, a woman who commands respect, but she's just not bonny and buxom anymore. And it's not like the glory days when they were first married and it was great and enjoyable. And so he's gone through various mistresses, and it didn't have to be Anne Boleyn. It's not because she shows up. Henry's looking already for a reason to get out of the marriage, and because it's clear he's not going to have a son. Mary is set up to receive education as a queen regnant, but Henry's just not sure, and so he also sets up, without telling Catherine, his bastard son by Elizabeth Blount, of Lord Henry Fitzroy, sets him up with his own training and education, rather in secret, royal education, just in case he needs to unbastardize him, to legitimize him. I couldn't find the word, to legitimize him and then make him king, which is always a dangerous thing. Even if you have Parliament legitimize someone who's a bastard, he's still a bastard. So yep. In that way, someone who clearly by fact was. And so that opens up the reign to civil war, and that's what you want to avoid. Henry wants his dynasty to be secure. Mary is the obvious choice, but just in case it's not going to work, because it's never worked up to this point for England to have a queen regnant, right? Mary is the one who in the future will pull it off. Yeah. And the only reason Elizabeth can happen is because Mary did it first. Otherwise, Elizabeth's reign would have been inconceivable without Mary. Mm-hmm. Right, because she showed a woman could pull it off, and she was completely immune to the traditional ways a woman will be attacked, which Elizabeth was very open to, namely chastity issues. And so, anyway, that was because of the Duke of Somerset and what have you. The Earl Seymour, sorry, Thomas Seymour. Let's not do that. So not Somerset. Somerset's Edward VI's reign. But anyway, so let's get back to the great matter. So Anne Boleyn, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn. She's abroad as a courtier. She's in the French court. She learns to speak very fluent French, and she observes how mistresses are used and discarded. So she decides not to become one. She comes back to England, and she shows up at court. When Henry noticed her is unknown, but she was, in fact, very close to which I can't remember which member of the nobility is which earl it was.
Was it Norfolk or
No, it
North?
wasn't Norfolk.
I thought they were related.
I think it was the Earl of Leicester, but I could be wrong about that too. I can't remember. It's not coming to my brain right now. It should be. But nevertheless, so she's very close to being betrothed to this particular Earl. And then at some point, Henry notices her. And what happens here is that, he see Anne. Oh, sorry, you're going to say something?
No.
Okay. Anne is described as sexy and not beautiful. As in, she's attractive, but in a way that appeals to lower appetites. And there's various other things about her, but she's also very, very witty, very intelligent, very, very joyful. And so she's also of what they called Reformed opinion, which means you're a secret Lutheran, is a polite way of saying it. So Henry notices her at some point, and then gets Wolsey to break up whatever's going on with her and this Earl. And so Wolsey does it. Now, Anne Boleyn, of course, doesn't know that this is Henry, so she gets a hatred for Wolsey because she really did like this particular fellow. And Wolsey causes him to break it off because Wolsey tells him that he's upset the king's interest in this matter. And so then he gives, he sends his ministers to Anne and asks her to become his mistress. And she says no. And this is very intriguing to Henry, and turns him on even more. It's
playing hard to get.
This is the only way you can tell a king no. You can't punish someone for not committing mortal sin with you. So this is something that Henry just moves him, right? And so they begin courting, and she tells him she'll settle for nothing less than being queen. So this gets various things in Henry's mind turning. And then he sets to work. He sets up this mock trial where he has one of the gentlemen of the bedchamber accuse him of living in an invalid marriage, to being married incestuously to his brother's widow. And this is against the scripture verse in Leviticus. All this has been prepared, right? And so Henry then asks Wolsey to investigate and adjudicate the case. And basically grant the annulment, right? This whole thing's a farce in order to get the ball rolling. Catherine has absolutely no idea what's even going on. Henry then, trusts Wolsey to get the goods. Wolsey looks at it, and then he's looking at the nature of his authority, and he's starting to question, can I do this? I don't know if I can do this. And he's looking at it. It's like, well, technically I can. I mean, popes have given annulments for much less, and maybe I won't be overruled. But maybe I will. So he goes to consult John Fisher, the very first person he goes to consult. And pretends it's someone else, but Fisher knows exactly who it is and what's going on. And so he goes, and Fisher kind of shreds the argument from Leviticus immediately and points out that the church fathers read the line in Leviticus with that in Deuteronomy, which says you are to marry your brother's widow to raise children to her name, to his name, sorry. And that this, so they read it together that if the husband dies childless, then the brother may marry the widow. And so this is how they reconcile the two verses. Not to mention, he looked at the dispensation. He said, this dispensation is kind of odd. There's things that we have to look at here. So he gives very much the negative answer, whereas Wolsey was looking for the green light. And if Fisher had given him the green light, he would have gone right ahead and granted the annulment. Leo X was busy in other matters. The Habsburgs would have been mad, but already would have been done.
It's amazing Wolsey cares, sort of, just in a sense that he's a crafty man that, you wouldn't think. I guess modern me thinking today, I couldn't imagine a certain cardinal, an American cardinal, would really care that much.
Right. Yeah, I know. And whether it was Wolsey's fear that he was exceeding his authority, a sudden compunction of conscience, or a sympathy for Catherine, even, who knows? But I don't think it was sympathy for Catherine as much as a fear that he couldn't really do it. He'd be exceeding his authority, and being overruled would be even worse than not coming up with it. So instead, he concludes his inquest and decides to refer the whole matter to the Pope in Rome. And he decides he'll use his contacts in Rome in order to help him. The problem was, this is 1527. And you have the Sacco di Roma, which Wolsey does not know yet has happened. So the Sacco di Roma, the sack of Rome, what happens is Clement VII is the new pope. He's another Medici pope. You have Leo X as a Medici pope. Now, the younger brother is now another Medici pope, Clement VII. Not against reform in the beginning, but he just kind of sets into the laxity of the papal court and lets things get worse. And then he intervenes politically in the never-ending conflict between Charles V and Francois I, the Holy Roman Empire and the French fighting it out again in Italy. He decides to switch to the French, back the French in Italy. Charles is in Spain, by the way. He sends his instructions that the armies should be brought within striking distance of Rome, just to let the Pope know, you done bad, bro. To put it that way. This is not a good thing. So Rome was largely undefended at that time for different reasons. Papal troops have been sent with the French, and so they weren't expecting an attack. Charles did not order an attack, actually. And, I think he can be sufficiently defended, at least in that regard. But what happens is twofold. The army's pay went into arrears, so they were not happy. And you had a large number of Lutherans. Remember back a while ago, we were talking about Landsknechts, right? Private military corps working with pike and shot and cavalry. And they, had their own rules, their own laws for each regiment. Some whole regiments were Lutheran. And you have about 10,000 troops that were Lutheran constituting these regiments. So when their pay goes into arrears, having listened to Luther and his ministers preach about Rome being the whore of Babylon and so many things, they decide we need to set down on that right now and completely destroy it. And they actually get one of the noblemen in the army to side with them. Some of them depart and they're like, well, we can't be a part of this. And so the bulk of this army sets upon Rome and breaks into the city, sacks the city. Clement VII escapes to Castel Sant'Angelo, which is too fortified for them to take. And it's the old mausoleum of Hadrian right across the Tiber from the Vatican. Great to visit. You can still see, it was fortified sometime in the Middle Ages. So they can't get in there. Instead, they destroy everything else. The city is in absolute ruins, absolute just devastation. Not one in 100 people could challenge property in their house. So much was destroyed. All these great Renaissance buildings, because Rome really had become the seat of the pagan Renaissance at that time in many respects. That's overly focused on the pagan arts, not enough on the mission of the church. And then horrible things happen to nuns in the city, of course, and even in the papal apartments themselves, they break into the Raphael rooms, and underneath the Disputation on the Eucharist, which Raphael had painted for Julius II, they scribbled Luther's name in with their swords underneath, right? And so, which eventually they sanded out. But so this is huge disaster. Now, Charles V wasn't about to let a crisis go to waste, so he returns from Spain eventually. And, his troops, they have Clement locked up in Castel Sant'Angelo as prisoner, even though they can't get in. They send messages back and forth. He's basically the prisoner in the city, as long as the Germans hold. So Charles, and so now Wolsey makes his appeal to the Pope, not knowing all this is going on. So now the Pope is being asked to grant an annulment on the basis of the dispensation was invalid because it was against Scripture. And he's being told to grant this annulment to Henry against Charles V's aunt. This is not going to go over well. Now, Charles V really didn't care about her situation. When in 1525, he broke the alliance, never paid Henry the money he promised after Henry had expended so much in his behalf, and broke the betrothal to Mary without, so much as a courtesy of a formal letter going to England. He wasn't worried about what would happen to Catherine as a result of his actions, but now all of a sudden he's worried because family honor. Hey, I gotta do something about this. So he hears about it and he says, in no way will you grant that annulment. Clement VII does actually escape to French protection at a certain point, and he does, then he decides to have a case set up. So he sends one Cardinal Campeggio over to England. Campeggio actually it was beneficed of a diocese in England, so he was understood to know English affairs. So he comes over to set up a court of inquest, and making it look to Henry like this is going to be a very serious trial, and they're going to really look at this. But he was given a brief by Clement VII: delay, and if a decision has to be made, just refer it back to me. Don't, because what Clement is hoping for is that the traditional tactics of delay will solve his problem for him. Maybe Catherine will die of natural causes. Maybe the issue will go away. And he will not be forced to make a decision that's going to put him in political trouble with the emperor. Right. And so this is what's going on. So Fisher is as a chaplain to Queen Catherine, he's part of the defense. So Henry has basically through Wolsey given all the brief to the bishops. Everyone's going to support this, right? Right. And so Fisher doesn't say anything. So he gives the appearance that he consents. So at the inquest, there is the great scene where Catherine, appeals, "Have I not been your wife for so long?" It's recorded in Shakespeare's Henry VIII, which the text of that actually comes from William Rastell, who was a relation of More's, was More's nephew, and he ran a printing press, and so he had gotten an account of what Catherine had said at this papal inquest, and leaving Henry somewhat out of sorts because he didn't know how to respond to her. And he's not good at direct confrontation. So, so the next day, they move certain articles and certain, arguments, and Fisher gets up and declares he is not, because he shows the document, all the bishops have signed this in favor. And Fisher gets up and he says, "I have not." And Henry's like, what isn't your seal here? And he looks and it's not there. Of course, Fisher was just merely quiet, didn't speak up. So the silence veils dissent in this case. And he begins on this whole treatise he's worked on, going back through so many things, the church fathers, theologians. Now, Fisher is a very good speaker and a very deeply learned theologian, and a very much learned in the church fathers. His writings against Luther, citing the church fathers in favor of the papacy, had convinced Thomas More that the papacy was a divine office, and he had been wrong about it. And so when he wrote Fisher on how great a contribution he had made in this regard, right? And so and More and Fisher certainly professionally had dealt with each other more, but they were not still like close, intimate friends. But now they were at least much better known to each other. So Fisher now stands up in the inquest and he declares, "I'm ready to lay down my life like a new St. John the Baptist." And which, of course, the implication is that Henry would be like Herod, which they didn't take too well. The early biographer records that before this inquest even happened, Henry had asked Fisher to come and to get his opinion on things. And Fisher said, "Well, your conscience can be set at rest, my lord, for these reasons, because, so he lays down all these reasons why Henry's marriage to Catherine is valid. So let your conscience be at ease." Well, that wasn't what Henry wanted to hear. So the early biographer relates that Henry never looked upon him with favor again. Which not surprising. So now he's really ticked off at Fisher's messing up this whole inquest, throws the whole thing into confusion, and Wolsey is just like sweating. He doesn't know what to do. And so Fisher's able to give this whole treatise and others. So then Henry gets Stephen Gardiner to come in on his side. Now, Stephen Gardiner was a Cambridge man, which Fisher was the chancellor of that university. And Gardiner was part of a association at Cambridge called Little Germany. And this included Thomas Cranmer, a man named Barnes, a few other characters, and they were all Lutherans. But of course, the official term was we were of Reformed opinion, which again meant you were a closet Lutheran in one form or another. And like I think I mentioned, Cranmer was part of this. Cranmer was an obscure Cambridge don who worked as a tutor, and actually went to the continent and married. It was even though he was a Catholic priest and went in as a Lutheran minister, his wife died, and so he came back and resumed being a Catholic priest again. It seems it's a weird story with Cranmer. Everything about Cranmer is the guy is totally wishy-washy in every way. I mean, when he's the Archbishop of Canterbury for Henry, he burns people who believe the very same thing he believes, because that's the way he's going to stay in power. So anyway, getting backward, to this. So Gardiner is part of this circle, and he's ready to get royal favor by assisting Henry here. And it says, well, are you trying to say that it says to John Fisher, are you trying to say that our Lord King is a Herod? And I wonder if Gardiner remembers that several years later when Henry does exactly that to John Fisher. Fisher actually had a great devotion to John the Baptist. He has on his altar what's called the St. John's head. This great, wonderful, bust with St. John the Baptist's head on it after martyrdom, and that stood, usually they would be a reliquary that would contain a relic or a supposed relic of John the Baptist. And that was always on Fisher. When they raid Fisher's chancery, they record that being on the altar, right? So anyway, so the inquest continues. It gets bad. Anne is getting very impatient with these whole proceedings, and so is Henry. And then at last, Campeggio follows through with the papal brief and refers the whole matter back to the Pope in Rome. It failed. So Wolsey is now on the outs, and he goes back. He resigns the chancellorship. He gives Henry his palace at Hampton Court, which he had developed. There's a lot of interesting studies on Wolsey in terms of his love for architecture, church music, all things that'll take us far afield. They're all very interesting. So Wolsey had built this great Renaissance palace that is Hampton Court. You can still see much of it as it was in Wolsey's time today, and it's been added to, of course, very much. Wolsey then goes back to York because he's technically the Bishop of York, to start managing the diocese he's never actually sat in before. And in the midst of this, he learns that Henry is cooking up a treason trial for him, which means he'll be hanged, drawn, and quartered. So he's writing. His servant says he riseth not even to piss, as it were. So it's cited in context there. It's what they say, because he's simply writing to everyone to do what he can to obtain the annulment for the king. A lot of people say the king's divorced, and it's important to understand nobody divorced properly until about 1686 or 1692 was the first divorce in England. Divorce as in the state coming in and deciding that a perfectly valid marriage may be broken. Right. Milton was a big advocate for divorce, actually, John Milton, but in the 17th century, but it was still illegal. You could only annul a marriage, right, up until that point in the late 17th century, is that. So Henry was getting an annulment, not a divorce. And so Wolsey's trying to obtain it. He can't. And eventually he expires, declaring, "Oh, would that I serve my God as well as I serve my king." Right. Famous last words there. He's out of the picture. And so Henry decides no more clerics in charge. And so he taps his good friend, Thomas More, good friend Henry and More were friendly. But More also kept himself, a certain degree of aloof because he knew what kind of man Henry was, right? So he taps More to be the new Lord High Chancellor. And now this is where More really distinguishes himself. And first thing off, Henry wants him to advocate for the annulment. And he leaves the whole case with More. And More says, "I'm not really convinced, but I promise as your High Chancellor, I'm not going to argue against it." And Henry said, all right, because he knew More to be a just and fair man. So he was satisfied with that. And so he opens up Parliament. And More had opened up Parliament before, actually in 1523, when it was the head of the Speaker of the Commons. He had actually asked Henry for the permission for free speech for everyone in the Commons, so everyone may speak freely without fear of recrimination. And Henry grants it. And so More actually is the origin of the tradition of the English Parliament today, which is that you should have free speech within the parliamentary chamber. And he's actually the origin of that.
Interesting.
So in the 1523 Parliament. Then there is, so now More will open up Parliament officially in 1530. And this is known as the Reformation Parliament, not from what it starts right then, but this Parliament will continue to sit until 1536. And it will see through the English Reformation, to its. So it's ironic that More is the one who opens it up. More, as Lord High Chancellor, is also in charge of repressing heresy, and this is a point that a lot of people are confused about. So More writes this book back in the late 15 teens called Utopia. Now the word itself means nowhere in Greek. Right. And it's the origin of the phrase we now use, utopianism, and the idea where society is perfect. Utopia is a fictional account of this fellow named Hythloday that visits an island of people who are pre-Christian, who have gotten to the furthest point they can get to by the light of natural reason. And so Hythloday explains the customs that he observes amongst the people of Utopia and how they despise gold and riches. And, they used gold for urinals to show how much they despised riches. And that that people could speak freely. They had a certain freedom of speech. That there were no flatterers. They despised flatterers, because More actually did not suffer fools gladly, and he was not into flattery. He hated flattery. So he so that kind of comes through in the account, and it's like a satirical but also fictional mocking of society and corruption in the church too, to a certain extent, by through these various vehicles. And it's not, see, and then the 19th century people picked it up as an apology for communism, and that's definitely not what More is about, right? Because you have this society where there's no private property, the government is a republic, and which is commonweal, is how it's translated. Now it's actually that's how everyone had translated it into English since early in the Middle Ages, the commonweal, that is the common benefit, which is correct in terms of the actual origin of the term, but often it's used to mean republic, as in the sense of republican government, rather than the commonweal. And this is More's notion of it, is that it refers to this common thing and everything. So what happens then in Utopia is that More even puts himself in the dialogue to ask questions and kind of mock the whole enterprise. But what he's really getting at comes from St. Augustine, right, in the City of God, where for Augustine there is but the city of God in the city of man. And the city of man will always be hopelessly corrupt. Not only is it not perfect, it can't be good either, because of the reality of our nature, that only the city of God is perfect, and that is what we should tend. And More is echoing this from St. Augustine with Utopia, as well as the other great book of his, Richard III, right, where it shows a state that the English state is also not good, even though it may be necessary, right? And it was actually turning from Richard III, because he thought it would get him in a bit too much trouble, that he went to write Utopia. And so there's many things that we could talk about Utopia, would be stuck on it for a long time. So people wonder, so More writes a society where they have freedom of speech, and he seems to extol that. So why is More repressing heresy? Secular authors wonder. And the reason is because More, as Catholic, looks at heresy the way any person of his time did, even Protestants on the other side of it, as the killing of the soul, which is a far greater evil than the killing of the body. And as a result, heresy, a heretic, was worse than a murder. And therefore, any and all means had to be taken to repress heresy. And what has happening is that, because of connections in the Baltic and in others, and other connections to England, German tracts propaganda were coming over into England to spread Lutheranism. William Tyndale, who becomes a Lutheran, he's fluent in German. He translates Lutheran tracts directly into a very fluent and readable English. He gets on a project to translate the Bible into English that would be far more advanced than Wycliffe's attempts. And what he does with that is it's particularly brilliant in the flow of the English, but it also does exactly what Wycliffe did in terms of the anti-clericalism, rendering scripture verses in ways specifically in a different way than was customary to denude the church. Essentially, to take away verses, any verse used to prove anything Catholic was usually re-rendered, sometimes violently, with the origin of the text, and away from the sense of the fathers too. But it was extremely readable English, unlike Wycliffe, whereas John Wycliffe in the 15th century, his Bible, which his translators had so much reverence for the Latin, they just put it word for word, and it was very unintelligible into English, although it was something. So this was a very good English, the Tyndale Bible, and he starts getting ready to cycle it in, and then a bishop makes the fatal error of purchasing up the entire run. And Tyndale says, wow, this is great. It's going to give me money to do an even better version. And he's going to get the opprobrium for burning the Bible. It's going to be awesome. And that's exactly what happens. The Bishop of Cologne buys up the whole run of Tyndale and burns it. And Renaissance humanists, scorn the whole thing. You're burning the word of God.
Mhm.
Then Tyndale has all the money he needs to do a better, more efficient edition, exactly as he predicted. And that begins to be shipped over into England. So this is some of the stuff More is repressing. More writes several dialogues. He's actually asked by Bishop Tunstall. Cuthbert Tunstall is a great friend of Fisher, another reforming humanist, to write tracts against, the dialogue against heresies, the dialogue on purgatory, and so many. And the dialogue on purgatory actually shows More's characteristic wit and humor, because in the midst of this very serious treatise defending purgatory against Tyndale, he then adds that he gives this little depiction of the souls in purgatory looking down earth where they used to live, and it says, and they will see their wives now married to new husbands, and they'll tell their new husbands that nothing they do is right. If only you were like my first husband who was perfect, even though in life they were wont to tell us otherwise. Rather humorous stuff, but anyway, so to bring it all to a conclusion, Henry sees exactly where the trouble is, and so now he has a new idea, and this was because Anne Boleyn has brought in her chaplain into the royal household, and her chaplain is none other than Thomas Cranmer. So Cranmer comes to Henry after the failure of the inquest, and he says, see, you're going about this all wrong. In the Bible, we have kings, we have bishops, but I don't see popes. There's no popes there. Do you see popes in the Bible? I don't see popes in the Bible. So rather than ask the Pope to give dispensations, which he has no authority to give because he's merely the Bishop of Rome, you are the head of the Church of England. And on top of that, there's some other things that Henry had kind of pinholed for later. There was a trial, the Richard Hunn trial, which you'd have to look that up to know more about it because we're too much out of time. But the conclusion of the Richard Hunn trials, it was a man who sued the church. And they used a medieval law by Edward I, the Longshanks, if you remember Braveheart, although don't learn any history from Braveheart because it's all wrong. But Edward the Longshanks, the first, was a very brutal king. He was in war against Philip the Fair of France. And, Philip was raising money from the church and he wanted to do it too. And the Pope said, no, you can't do that. They said, oh, really? And say, I'm going to do it anyway. And so the Pope put England under interdict. And so he, forbade all appeals to Rome. And it was a law called Praemunere, which is, a law basically, you can't make any appeals beyond the seas to Rome. It's an act of treason. Now, it sat on the books. Nobody paid attention to it. But this decision decides that the church was in the wrong in this particular lawsuit because of the law of Praemunere. And now Henry's been looking at that law. And so now he uses it. So he goes, so all the bishops are meeting in convocation. Wolsey has fallen. So now Archbishop Warham takes up his role again as the Archbishop of Canterbury, being head of the church, the head see in the church in England. Mm-hmm. And Henry's ministers come and declare that they're all guilty of violating Praemunere by accepting Wolsey's authority, forgetting for a moment that it was Henry who forced Wolsey's authority on them. But that's of no concern. And therefore they had to pay a fine, or their lives would be forfeit. Now, if they had all resisted, if you had a Thomas Becket in the group, or in the Archbishop of Canterbury, I should say, it might have gone very differently. But instead, the only one to speak out was Fisher. Fisher's the one who opposes it, but a lot of the bishops aren't sure, and they're looking to Warham for leadership because he's the bishop, he's the head of the English Catholic Church, right? He's the primatial see. So they're looking to him for direction. He's just not giving. He's terrified. He's an old age. It's an old man. He's been dominated by Wolsey. Now Henry's coming in declaring their lives are forfeit unless they will do a certain thing, pay him a ton of money, and declare him, Henry, to be the head of the Church of England. It was a ruse to neutralize the church, trusting that most of these men are very venal and depend upon royal favor for everything they've received, except for Fisher. And Fisher is the one who speaks out, and he's the only one. So Fisher, then when he can't get resistance to this. So Fisher proposes, all right, well, let's accept that the king has said, but with the proviso, praeter legem Christi permittat, so far as the law of Christ allows. And so, Warham, thinks about it, and he agrees. He says, all right, let's all agree to do that. And that's what they do. And so, and Henry at first is really angry about this. but he sees how easily the clergy caved and paid the money. So he demands more money, and they pay it. And so now at that point, Henry realizes he's got the church. And so we'll deal with the title later. And now he's got more or less what he needs out of them. He's neutralized the church. Now Parliament begins. And bills start being passed through the Commons because Henry has a very efficient process of working in this various documentation. So one of the figures that arises that becomes Henry's Secretary of Letters is someone who used to be a secretary to Wolsey, survived Wolsey's fall, and made his usefulness known to Henry, also of Reformed opinion, i.e. Lutheran, and that's Thomas Cromwell. Not a lot is known about Cromwell's early life. He was an MP in 1522. Not much is known. He travels to Italy for a little while. He fights as a mercenary for some of the Italian wars. He comes back, but nobody knows precisely all of his doings, his writings, his flaws. There's a lot of gaps to be filled in by the imagination, but we know him now. And he's very crafty. He's very politically savvy. And he's working the scheme to, again, do what Wolsey couldn't, get Henry what he wants. Because Wolsey could only get what he wanted if it would work within the framework of the church. Now, the exception of More, the men around Henry are working this all about. And remember that in 1521, Henry believed the papacy was a divine office and More did not. Now, in 1531, Henry questions, at the very least, or positively doesn't believe the papacy is a divine office, and More does. So Fisher has written many books about the marriage to Catherine and Henry being valid, and he's going to continue to do so. There's another fellow named Thomas Abel, who was the Queen's chaplain, and she one of the Queen's chaplains. He goes to Spain, promising Henry to get, because he had to get leave to leave the kingdom, right? He promises Henry is going to get things that'll help the case, and Henry takes that to mean help his case, but he actually means help Catherine's. So he goes down and he gets a number of documents that he sees in Spain, and he writes a book, Veritas Invicta, Truth Unconquered, right? as it lays out the whole case, in favor of the validity of the marriage to Catherine. Henry reads it. Oh, he's mad, and he loses his scholarly composure and actually writes a note in English. It's false. This is a lie. And then finally he recomposes himself and then writes a Latin summary at the front of the book. The whole basis of this is false, and has Abel promptly arrested. And Abel will rot in the tower until 1537, I believe, or 8, when Henry finally gets around to beheading him. Actually, he got the full treatment too. It wasn't like More and Fisher, we got commuted to merely beheading. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and then beheaded. So bad. So Abel, of course, is Saint Thomas Abel is a martyr. But that's the future for him. So that Henry's canvassing the opinion of universities, anything that can kind of help him, because he's not ready to make a definitive break, but he puts all the legislation in place. So the Parliament starts getting stuff on the statute book. Heresy. So by the Heresy Act, bishops are restrained from initiating heresy trials. There must now be a formal accusation by 2 witnesses, and any such case could be heard. And it further enacted that speaking against the Bishop of Rome or his pretended power was no longer deemed to be heresy. Then you have the submission of clergy and the restraint of appeals, which basically reinforces praemunire. You have statutory form to the submission of the clergy of 1532. Convocation is now forbidden by law to assemble except by the king's writ. Convocation is sort of like a bishop's conference. All the bishops in England get together.
Yeah.
And all its decrees in the future are subject to the royal assent, etc. Ecclesiastical appointments and the restraint of annates. So the annates tax, it's a source of so much trouble in the Middle Ages because it was actually originally designed for the Crusades, and it stayed on the books. Every bishop, the first year of his bishop, the full year's salary had to be paid to the Pope. So the Pope didn't much care who a king nominated to be a bishop, as long as he got the money. That's what developed, even though it was never meant to be that way to begin with. So it was a hated tax. Everyone agreed it should go, but getting rid of it was so hard because the papal curia depended on stuff like that. So Henry does not abolish Inates. In fact, Inates would stay for 2 more centuries in England, whereas the rest of the continent, the church got rid of it after the Council of Trent. Actually, even before the Council of Trent, if I'm not mistaken. But the problem then was, and the repudiation of Inates. So the money is not paid to the Pope. Instead, it's paid to the king. It would stay that way. So every bishop in England now would pay the Inates tax to the king, the first year's income, not to the Pope. Any acts of dispensation and all these things, all of these are going to, more and more detail to take away the power of the church. So Fisher at one point speaks up in the House of Lords, and Henry has him arrested on a bill of attainder for that, and then lets him go. And the break will come later. Then, as they're canvassing, Bishop Warham ordains a priest, and without royal approval, or no, consecrates a bishop. Sorry, without royal approval. And Henry says that's a violation of Priminere, and then Warham suddenly gets a little bit of backbone, and he fights back, and he said this is the very thing for the right of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which Thomas of Becket had fought for. St. Thomas of Canterbury had fought for. Gets a little bit of backbone all of a sudden, but then he dies. Perfect timing for Henry. And the Pope had given indications he might consider favorably the case. So there's an Indian summer of favorable relations, which Henry uses to have Thomas Cranmer appointed as his Archbishop of Canterbury. Puts him his man in the right place. And of course, the problem with Indian summers is they are brief. Thomas Cranmer then, Henry had and Anne at a certain point, Anne was satisfied that she'll be queen. Anne had given in and finally slept with Henry, and now she was pregnant. So now there's a little bit of urgency to do something about the whole deal. So Cranmer decides summarily that the marriage between Henry and Catherine was invalid, and now he is going to marry Henry and Anne. And he so does. The Simpsons actually had a funny joke about this, where they depict characters from The Simpsons in Henry VIII. And so they have Reverend Lovejoy as Cranmer saying, "So I declare you by the authority invested in me by you." I mean, more or less what happened. And so, and so the marriage happens and is publicized, and then the coronation is put forth. So More at this point, More had been brilliant as Lord High Chancellor. Wolsey had never taken his job seriously, so he rarely ever sat on the King's Bench hearing cases. More sits down and for 6 months does nothing but hear cases, and he's cleared out the cases. So one day, finally, they asked, "Is there another case to hear?" And they said, "No, they've all been heard." And praise God, let us adjourn for a month. And so it was hard work clearing all that out, but he did. Although he did make some, offend some people by not finding in their favor, and they'll come back at his trial to get him. But More had become, extremely, wealthy at this point. He had moved his family to a new residence, Chelsea, and was still very busy with so many things. He sets up Chelsea to be, the ideal residence. There's a painting by Holbein depicting them there, which I can't talk about today. It's going to take far too much time. We're already, I don't know how far over. We might as well finish.
Yes.
So anyway, so he's got all these things in order. He has a private chapel. He hears mass daily, and so many things. That as his devotion deepens and his desire to be free of the world deepens even more. He and his daughter are closer than ever. And Margaret too was an accomplished humanist. Meg, his oldest daughter, she was a very accomplished humanist, Latin scholar, Greek scholar, just brilliant all around. She'd even published a book which almost got them in quite a bit of trouble back in the 1520s. Yeah. And More had to seek Wolsey's help because the church was going to get after she published a translation of Erasmus's commentary on the Lord's Prayer. And so it's the church authorities were going to investigate because it would contravene church law. And so More had to go to Wolsey, and the two didn't always get along, and get Wolsey to license the book to get the church off his back. So, she was very brilliant. There's a great scene in A Man for All Seasons where Margaret meets Henry VIII and they speak in Latin at great length, and then it switched to Greek, and Henry doesn't know Greek well enough, and he's duly impressed, right? So they're really, even though she's married to William Roper, who actually turns out to be a bit of a scallywag.
Really?
Later. At first, he's in Lutheran circles. More gets him out, and he just deals with the fact he becomes a little bit better. But then later in life, he writes an account of Thomas More to kind of rewrite his own role in certain things, because he, of course, takes the act of royal supremacy, gives no support to More during the when it all comes to an end. So
okay.
Anyway, so More is in its really good position, but now this all happens, and More sees exactly where it's all going. So he formally resigns as a Lord High Chancellor, decides to go into retirement, and that is the first thing, of course, that made his wife rather upset, because now he's got to, do all kinds of other things to get money in. Now, since the budgets are going to get a bit tight, but he just couldn't in conscience be a part of it anymore, because within all the great architecture of politics and religion, Wolsey said, "If only I'd served my God as well as I served my king." More has always endeavored to serve his God far better than he serves his king, but serve his king nonetheless. And now the two were at loggerheads, and he knew he could not, and so disappeared from the picture. Now, he was invited to Anne Boleyn's coronation, and he did not show up. And that was noted, and it embarrassed Anne. Anne was not very popular, we might also add. She was very much hated by the London crowds. Catherine was good Queen Catherine. She bestowed alms very liberally amongst the people and was celebrated. Anne was very much hated. She was declared to be a witch or harlot or so many other types of things, and which ultimately weren't really fair to her, even though she is quite in the wrong side of this thing. But but she wasn't those things. Henry, even later in life, would come to believe that Anne was actually a secret witch and had cast a spell on it. In the 1540s, Henry starts thinking that. But so maybe it is true. I don't know. She certainly cast a spell on his passions, without a doubt.
It just reminds me of sort of Adam blaming Eve for all of his sins.
Indeed. That's what it strikes me as. And so, especially when you look at Anne's fall, which we won't get to. So we're going to focus more on the final acts. So Henry puts out, with Cromwell's connivance, the Act of Succession, right? And so the Act of Succession was very simple. It simply said that the king, ratified by Parliament, it shall determine that the heirs shall be Henry and Anne's issue. Now, both More and Fisher were willing to swear to that, because kings and parliaments can decide who the succession will be, right? And that wasn't an issue for them in conscience or in law.
Yeah.
And so, but then there's a preamble, which required an oath. It was kind of ambiguous, but required an oath, which would imply the acceptance of the invalidity of the marriage between Henry and Catherine, which also thereby bastardized the Princess Mary. The validity of the marriage between Henry and Anne, legitimizing Princess Elizabeth, and the absolute interdiction of marriage within the prohibited degrees, with the implication that neither the Pope nor anyone else could grant a dispensation, and the absolute power of the bishops to annul unlawful marriages without appeal to Rome. As in, the king says, "All right, I need you to do this for me." Okay, we'll do that. And so they bring in, all the bishops and the major clergy to come swear the Act of Succession. So Fisher is, of course, there and expected to swear it, and likewise More. So More asks for some time to study it. Fisher asks for some time to study it. Even at this juncture, where Henry's setting up the game to get both of them, especially Fisher. Fisher most of all, More secondarily because he snubbed Anne and she's been whining and crying about it, but More of a Fisher most of all because he publicly humiliated Henry with his works defending the marriage. So they study it over and they realize this preamble, if we swear, it's one thing to swear the issue. And this is what Hilaire Belloc gets very confused about in his book, Characters of Reformation. He gets this all wrong in every way in his chapter on Thomas More. And he thinks that because More was willing to swear the Act of Succession, that meant that he had no problem whatsoever with the marriage. And that's simply not true. Right. It's completely wrong. And it's because Fisher was willing to do exactly the same thing. Right. It's again, he read one thing and he didn't read all the sources and he got very mixed up in it, unfortunately. So, but nevertheless, so these acts, all had to be sworn to. They wouldn't do it. So they were put in the tower. Interesting thing happens when they go to Fisher's residence to his chancery. They get in. So Cromwell's ministers, because he's been, arrested for treason, all his goods are forfeit. So Cromwell's men go in to take whatever's of value for the king. So as they're going through, everything in the register is declared to be old. The bed, old, probably not replaced since he got in there. The servants all had new beds and good furnishings, but everything Fisher had was old. This or that other thing he described, old, years old. Everything is described as old. There's really nothing of value in his chancery.
Yeah.
Then they find a safe, and they say, "All right, here we go. Here's where the goods are." So they get 3 locksmiths from nearby to come in and get this safe open. And finally, they get it open. And what did they find? A hair shirt and a whip. No gold, no treasure, and such. The only thing of value they had was Fisher's library, which actually belonged to Cambridge, but they had loaned it to the bishop so that he could, study and do so many things. Massive, very well built library, a lot of works of church fathers and so many other things. Well, Henry confiscated it, and so Cambridge never got it back. So many other things that go on with that are quite terrible. More doesn't get quite the same treatment. And then there's other things that I didn't bring up, like the Nun of Kent. There's no time to talk about that really. So just get to the nitty gritty. So Fisher more in the Tower, and so they pass notes between each other, and so they spend basically agree that they should never say anything, that they should both just be silent about the oath, not swear it, and not deny it. Right. So because they're not rushing to martyrdom, but at the same time they're not going to deny anything. And for More, More is very conscious of this. Becket is rushing to martyrdom. St. Thomas Becket is doing everything he can to get someone to kill him so he'll be a martyr, practically. Antagonizing the whole of England to make his point about the independence of the church. And he is martyred. More is playing a careful game, and likewise Fisher. So Fisher, writes no more, even as early as Henry and Anne's marriage. He wrote no more on the validity of the marriage with Catherine. He's questioned very extensively. There's 2 books I sell, one on Thomas More, one on Fisher, and they both go through the interrogations that are recorded in the English archives that were conducted by Cromwell or his men, asking, did you have communication with anyone? Did you send this over the sea? Did you, anything they could use to hang them up on treason? Now it's looking for how we can kill them, because the longer they reside in the Tower, the more the resentment builds against Anne, the more unpopular the whole affair becomes. And More and Fisher might become a lightning rod for further, actions against him by the clergy. Cuthbert Tunstall is very much opposed to, what's happening. It was the Bishop of Durham, but eventually he falls into line as well. And so, they're languishing in the Tower. So Fisher doesn't have all the books and things that More has. And so he's forced to write many times for his homeopathics and for his botanicals, because that's what he's been using largely to keep him alive. He also writes, a treatise called The Spiritual Consolation. You could find this in English, at least it's on PDF on the internet. I'm sure it's in some collection, in some book, but which was written to his sister, who was a Dominican. And of course, on the Isle of Wight, and eventually fled to the continent because she wouldn't take the act of supremacy. And they, it's a really wonderful little treatise, about the fidelity to Christ, the gospel. More had a visitor, which was his daughter, Meg. So Meg goes to Cromwell, and she swears the royal supremacy, but she does it in such a way. She says, as far as the law of Christ allows. Cromwell, excited by this turn of events, for a moment drops his very astute mind and fails to catch this what the import of saying as far as the law of Christ allows, realizing that this whole thing was a ruse, that Meg certainly did not accept the royal supremacy, and she was just trying to be with her father. Cromwell instead sees this as an opportunity to use her as a wedge to force More to swear the act of succession and later the act of supremacy, and to get all this over with. So they spend many days and having debates, like when children, they think again to Aesop's fables, and that which was the very first thing as she read as a child. Margaret was able to read at about age 3, right? And so they on and on again. And More's favorite, of course, was the fable of the ape, right, as well as the fox and the grapes. But the ape, it was one of his favorites, one where a man who was a liar sees the ape, and the ape says, what am I, and what are all these apes around me? And he says, oh, why, you're a great king, and all these around, these are your knights and courtiers. And so the ape rewards him with all these golden riches. So the other man, who's a truthful man, sees that this guy lied so foolishly and is rewarded, so he should be rewarded even more for telling the truth. And so he says, well, you're an ape and an abominable beast, and all around you are apes. So the head ape tells the other apes to savagely tear him apart. And in the fable from Aesop is such, and this is such that happens to people who tell the truth to kings, right? And this is very much a theme that Moore picks up on in things like Richard III and Utopia and what have you. And, it's something that, and why he hates flatterers. So he's back and forth, but, he's having trouble. And it's really Margaret, his daughter Meg, that helps him have the strength to continue, even though he knows he's going to go to his death and martyrdom at the end of it. And she prays with him, they walk, they talk, and she becomes that comfort that he needs. Eventually, the correspondence between Fisher and Moore has been discovered, which of course they had burned, but the fact that they were doing it is discovered, so they're interrogated very heavily. And and Fisher's recorded as saying, it's a pity that we burnt it, because if you'd seen it, you'd see it was perfectly harmless. But there's still nothing they can hang them up on. Now there's a new pope, and he makes things a little bit worse. Pope Paul III, great reforming Cardinal Farnese, used to be a bit of bad behavior, now has turned his life around, is devoted to the reform of the church. And although he still has a bit of streak of nepotism with his grandchildren, that he gets into beneficed in his cardinals, which is bad, but he now is looking to reform the church, and he sees part of his reform program. He wants to elevate the life and the works of Fisher by making him a cardinal, and he's also hoping that by making Fisher a cardinal, Henry won't kill him. So then, his agents meet with Francois I and ask him what he thinks about it. Francois says, I can't tell you about Henry. He's completely unpredictable. One day he might treat me like a servant, and another day he'll treat me like a friend or like a king. I don't understand him. And Francois knew his man. He was unpredictable. So he warned them that this event would probably just make Henry angrier and not alleviate Fisher's position at all, which is precisely what happens when word comes that they want to make Fisher a cardinal. Henry's supposed to have said, let the Pope send his hat when he will. Unfortunately, he'll have to wear it on his shoulders. And it shows he already has the mind to have these men killed. It's just how it went. So of course Fisher is maliciously questioned, and to search whether he made any communication with the Pope in terms of being made a cardinal. He's rather shocked by the whole thing. Not anything he expected. So none of this works. So finally, it's all got to be brought to an end. So he has a new act, the Act of Royal Supremacy, where Henry is declared to be head of the Ecclesia Anglicana, the English church on earth, and furthermore denies the authority of the Pope in England. Now this is the formal break with Rome, and this is the vehicle whereby that break happens. It's not the annulment and everything that does it. It's this one act, and because the Pope still hasn't excommunicated Henry. For even though Henry is broken. So eventually that does happen. But in the meantime, now this act is in play, and anyone who maliciously swears against this supremacy or thinks against it shall be put to death. So it's thought crime. That's really what it is before its time. It's thought crime. You think contrary. So now, and it's basically getting even deeper. Can we know Fisher and Moore's mind? Because this is getting really ridiculous, and now they're being celebrated for their defiance. I can't have that. So Henry, finally gives up the traditional questioning through Cromwell, and I got to mention one more thing too. Fisher, while he's in the Tower, gets a deputation of bishops come in. Stephen Gardiner, Cuthbert Dunstall, some of whom are his friends. Gardiner is not, and Cranmer, of course, but Cranmer knows Fisher doesn't want to see him, so he stays outside. And these several bishops basically appeal to Fisher to accept the royal supremacy, and they basically say, "Come on, you're making us look bad." And Fisher says, "Alas, the fort has been betrayed, even by those who should have defended it." And which is it's comical in a certain way, but Fisher becomes the only bishop to stand against Henry. All the rest go in line. And so this fellow shows up to John Fisher, and we know his name is Richard Rich. And he says, well, I'm the king's trusty messenger. And this is all really regrettable, but he just wants to know what your actual thoughts are. It's not going to be used against you. He just wants to know what you really think. And then Fisher, who's not particularly streetwise and trusts the fact the guy swears on an oath that this won't be used against him, he says, well, since then, yeah, I don't believe the king can possibly be head of the Church of England. Done. That's all it was needed. And then Mr. Rich also goes to see More. Now, More knows Richard Rich. And he also, is not stupid. He's more streetwise than Fisher, who is a good bishop and too trusting. So More gives a completely vague answer that can't really be used, although they'll use it anyway. So the next day, Fisher is taken out of the tower, hauled in with the executioner with the axe facing out, and he goes in for his trial. And it's a very short affair because they bring in Richard Rich, who then says, well, he told me X. And Fisher says, but you said it wouldn't be used against me. You swore in an oath. And he said, so? And that, which shouldn't have been admitted in evidence, breaking an oath, but it was, because that's all they have. So then Fisher is formally condemned. The executioner comes back ahead of the carriage, holding the axe facing Fisher. So now it's clear he'd been condemned. And not too long ago, Fisher had seen the Carthusians who refused to swear the act of supremacy being taken and martyred, hang drawn and quartered and martyred for the faith. So now Fisher prepares himself, and he's brought out, and he declares that he prays. First the executioner begs his forgiveness, and Fisher says, "You have no need to ask forgiveness. Just do your job steadily and watch where the axe falls. Make sure don't make a bloody mess of the whole thing, please." And Fisher, even though they remove his clothes down to but a small shirt, he looks like a skeleton. And people have pity, and they say that a man such as this, if he were in the kingdom of the Great Turk, that is in the Ottoman Empire, and he had committed some great crime there, for shame the Great Turk himself would not have him killed in such a manner that Henry is doing now. And so Fisher, declares that he is dying for the Holy Church and for the papal supremacy. Couldn't be any clearer. And that he prays that the God will send the king a good counsel. And then with that, he puts his head down and is killed at a stroke. He should have been hanged, drawn, and quartered, but Henry had commuted on account of his age to merely beheading. And so, and right away, they try to make sure nobody can take a relic. They bury Fisher's body in an unmarked grave, and they take his head and bring it to London Bridge and stick it on a spike. Now, Fisher had never performed any miracles in life, but he performs a singular one in his death. London Bridge at that time was not what it is today. It was rather a covered bridge that went at a great length, and there were apartments on either side. And of course, because it's a bridge where there's trafficking, there's horses that, of course, leave their poo on the bridge. There's people with hogs and carcasses of chickens and other things that are supposed to be dumping the carcasses outside the city. Oh, go leave it by the bridge. So the whole area stank. But as long as Fisher's head was on the spike, it exuded the smell of roses. Everyone remarked upon
beautiful.
It. So after 2 weeks, it hadn't abated. So Henry finally orders it taken and thrown in the Thames, and to make way for Mr. More. Now, More's trial is very well documented. A good bit of the documentation works its way into the Man for All Seasons. A lot is put up. Of course, Richard Rich comes to give his testimony, and Man for All Seasons puts in the great line. It's not in the trial docs, but it's a great line. Richard, what profiteth a man if he, gain the whole world but loseth his soul? But for Wales. Now, actually, I don't believe he became head of Wales or whatever. What happened with Richard Rich, it's actually funny. He survives the reign of Henry. Surprise. He's a very good Protestant in the reign of Edward VI, and he becomes a very good Catholic in the reign of Queen Mary I. And in fact, he gets one of the biggest rosaries you could possibly imagine, just to show how Catholic he is. He's even reporting Protestants to the church authorities to try to have them burn them. And the church is like, go away. We don't want to do that. There's no reason to burn some poor idiot who's just spouting off heresy. Leave it alone. Richard Rich is doing all this. And then Elizabeth comes to the throne, and he quickly reverts right back to being a Protestant and dies in old age. Surprisingly, he makes it all the way into the 1580s under the reign of Elizabeth.
For some reason, I thought he died earlier under Mary.
Yeah, no, he makes it all the way into Elizabeth,
Okay.
becomes a Protestant again, and 1586, I believe he died. And so, yeah, he makes it a long way.
Wow.
But surprisingly, in old age. So, nevertheless, so More is condemned on this testimony. Other people, there's other chicanery in the trial, people that felt that he wronged them as Lord High Chancellor, tried to get it, and he defended himself extremely well against all these things. But finally, he's condemned. And More knows that the condemned may speak without being gainsaid. It's a right that had been conceded for quite some time. Lord Thomas Audley, who's the new Lord High Chancellor, grants him to speak. And so he begins. He finally admits, opens his mind. Henry could not be the head of the Church of England because that title had been conferred upon the Pope by their fathers and their fathers before England was even England. And Henry could no more be the head of the Church of England because all of Christendom recognizes the Pope as being the head of the church. And so, and he lays this down with marvelous oratory, and the council's disturbed and they're moved because, I mean, he has to be pronounced guilty, but it's a challenge and they can't answer it. And so Audley comes up with a particular bit of English positive law. The law is what the king and the parliament say it is. Done. So then More is then, taken, and eventually, he is executed. His head is also placed then on London Bridge, and not long after, his daughter Margaret rose up in the middle of the night, risking her very life, pays off the bridge warden, and receives her father's head and brings it back with her to lay to rest. As he was also beheaded. So then they begin, destroying Fisher's legacy. They try to besmirch him. Cromwell writes to Erasmus, who's on the continent, who was very good friends of both Fisher and More. And he writes to Erasmus and lets him know, by the way, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, your Cambridge pension and your Oxford pension will still be paid if you shut your trap about all this and don't embarrass the king. And that's essentially what Erasmus does. He doesn't cry out, whereas all of Europe is crying out over the murder of More and Fisher, the greatest statesman and the greatest bishop in all of Christendom. Until more recently, the only cardinal martyr, unless I'm mistaken, maybe is still the only cardinal martyr, actually, but there might be one I'm not aware of. So at least until recently. So Erasmus keeps his mouth shut. And like I said, they try to the 1521 preface to the assertion of the seven sacraments, or defense of the seven sacraments, is an embarrassment for Henry. So now they have to do this. So they try to blame Fisher's the one who wrote it. Fisher's the one who induced the king to put all this stuff in there, right? And they're held formally to be traitors to the crown, with under this new definition of treason, which is thought crime essentially. And so on and so forth. So that's that's how it happens, and how they gave their lives as glorious martyrs. Both for the unity of the church and for the rights of the papacy.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. What a terrible friend Erasmus turned out to be.
Yeah, no
doubt. Only looking for money at the end, I guess. That's sad.
And he was always in need of it.
Yeah, interesting. He was a priest, wasn't he? Was he not?
He was a cleric. I don't recall if he was ordained. I tend to doubt it, but I could be wrong. I'd have to double check. As far as I remember, he was tonsured, but he wasn't actually ordained to the priesthood.
Gotcha. Well, so that sounds like we've wrapped up the story of the two of them. Thank you, Ryan, for coming on to discuss it and explain the two of them and correct Belloc. I like that little element of it. So
I love Belloc. I love his prose, but there's things he gets wrong, and whether because he didn't have access to primary sources, or he heard some idea and got that as his idea, or he just kind of looked at it, made up his own mind on it. I have no idea, because he doesn't give us the sources, so it's hard to determine. Yeah.
And so you said a bunch of different books Mediatrix Press publishes. Will you tell us again what those are? So
certainly on this subject. So I have St. Thomas More, Great Man in Hard Times by Reynolds. I also have by the same author, St. John Fisher, Humanist Reformer Cardinal, or no, Humanist Reformer Martyrs, the subtitle, sorry. Then there is St. John Fisher by McNabb, Father Vincent McNabb, the Holy Dominican in the early 20th century. So McNabb's book tends more toward hagiography based on sound history. It's a wonderful little book, almost like a Shakespearean play. It's so well written, but again, towards devotion. Reynolds's book is a biography from a Catholic perspective, very well written, very well sourced, and very Catholic, but also a proper biography. And the same with Moore. So, and then I also have a book, Franciscans in the Revolution, which covers, it has a big long chapter on Catherine of Aragon, actually, which is very good because she was actually a third order Franciscan.
Okay.
So Franciscans in the Revolution is another good book on this subject. And finally, I would recommend another book on Thomas More. It's by a secular author. It's called A Daughter's Love, which is where is it? Oh. Yeah, good. By John Guy. I'm not actually sure how you say his name. I'm not sure if this is still the cover they run with, but it's a biography both of Thomas and of Margaret, and it does a great job of covering so much of what humanist education was, of Margaret's achievements and so many things, and much of the life of More. Actually, is very good that way.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Thank you again for coming on. I'll send people, or let's send the people that way to get any number of those books, whatever interests them.
Don't have
most.
The last one in case anyone's wondering, but I do have the other ones I mentioned.
Gotcha. Sounds good. Please help share this video, like, comment, and again, share so we can get this to as many people. And you're also on the Restoring the Faiths, with
The Rundown.
The Rundown, yes, the Rundown. So check out the Rundown as well. Anything else?
Not at the present. I'm still working on various things, audiovisual. I do have a subscription service on Mediatrix Press. It's just a book club, and for $10 you can get a book a month, an ebook, plus access to all the audio and anything in the e-library in terms of articles or audio. Still working on getting the video working. There's months and months worth of videos I'm still trying to get done and get loaded up and get finished, and so as I'm moving right now, so that's been slowing everything down. But anyway.
Gotcha. Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you again, and please subscribe to Plotlines and have a wonderful rest of your day, guys. Thank you for listening. Bye.